All right, part 2. Now we get to the gold. But first, did you do your homework assignment? Did you read Rationality.com? If you didn't, what are you waiting for? That's a life-changing resource that I gave you, and you're just going to leave it there? You're going to follow up on that? What we're doing here is we're extending the work from Rationality.com. I'm not covering all that same material because it's too much. There's too much detail there. That's a life-changing resource. You should take that resource seriously. And before we start to deconstruct, do more deconstruction here, let's just do a quick reminder of the idea that irrationality is a real thing. What is irrationality? That's something you need to contemplate. I'm not going to give you a definition. Contemplate that for yourself. Of course, this is really the inverse of what is rationality. You should be contemplating both of those questions. But I'll give you a few examples to help your inquiry. So here's some examples of irrationality. Horoscopes and astrology. What is the relationship between the orbit of Jupiter and your personal relationships and your romantic life? Probably nothing. Probably nothing. But people read these horoscopes, pre-rational people, they read horoscopes, they take astrology seriously. So a lot of what the irrational is it's a failure of understanding causal relationships within physical reality. So the pre-rational has difficulty with these causal relationships, and it attributes causal relationships where there aren't any, like with horoscopes, or for example, the Native American rain dance. You know, you have a drought and you need rain, so you do a little rain dance, and then the rain comes, and then you say, oh, I caused the rain. That's irrational. Why? Well, because that's just a coincidence that you did your little rain dance and then that caused the rain. Because if you did it 100 times and you kept track of every time you did a rain dance and whether the rain came, you would realize that the rain doesn't actually cause, your rain dance doesn't actually cause the rain. And this is where mankind makes the evolution from the pre-rational into the rational stage of development is that, and this is where we get science coming online. What is science? Science is the meticulous and rigorous tracking of these mechanical causal relationships, which was not happening at the pre-rational. That's why at the pre-rational you have all sorts of superstitious, mythological sorts of thinking. Another example of irrationality is with gambling. People who gamble tend to have various kinds of irrational superstitions. Maybe I'm playing poker and I happen to be wearing a red hat that day, and I play poker, and that day I happen to win a big jackpot at poker. And then I say, well, the next time I'm going to play poker, I'm going to wear my lucky red hat. This is my lucky red hat. It's going to help me win more, right? Well, what's the causal relationship there? There isn't one. That's why it's called superstition. But it's actually kind of really interesting because if you go deeper on that, you might say, well, just the fact that you believe that wearing your lucky red hat will make you win might actually make you win more because you'll actually be more confident in yourself. You'll maybe, make more bold bets. Of course, you could lose that way too. So it's not a reliable strategy. But, the placebo effect is a real effect. And so there are these interesting cases where actually you believing that your lucky red hat is lucky might actually make you lucky. You might actually end up creating that situation. But on the other hand, you could also lose all your money just as easily. Another example is thinking that God will save you from harm. Religious people believe in God, and then they pray to God and whatever. And then especially when they need it the most, like, when their children's lives are at stake or something like that, they'll pray to God to protect their children. Is God going to protect their children just because they want that? No, that's not how God works. So that's an example of irrationality. Another example of irrationality is with vaccines. So vaccine risk, and most anti-vaxxers are pre-rational people. Of course, it doesn't have to be that way. You can have legitimate concerns about vaccines. That's fine. Vaccines can be criticized from the pre-rational. They can be criticized from the post-rational. But most anti-vaxxers are pre-rational. And the reason you can tell that is because they think anecdotally. Like they'll say something like, I could ask them, so did you get a vaccine? And they'll say, oh no, the vaccine is so dangerous because, someone in my extended family, died from the vaccine. But that's just one anecdote. That doesn't demonstrate the danger of the vaccine, because you have to weigh the danger of the vaccine against the disease that it's protecting you from, right? And the only way you can do that is by doing rigorous scientific statistical analysis on large populations and sample sizes of millions of people, comparing, this statistically, and then you can see what the real dangers are, and you can numerically weigh the dangers of the disease versus the dangers of the vaccine. And if you do that, you'll realize that the vaccine is less dangerous than the disease. Not for everybody, of course. You can always find exceptions. There will be some people for whom that's not true. But when we're talking about public policy, that's how that works. So those are a few examples. Contemplate deeper what irrationality means. Okay, and a quick caveat here in that those of you who are serious philosophy students, like from university, you've taken university philosophy classes, they talk about rationalism as in rationalism versus empiricism. Be careful, because that's not what I'm talking about here. I specifically gave a detailed, long definition of what I mean by rationalism in part 1. That's why we went to great lengths to define it, because I'm not talking about that distinction between rationalism and empiricism that they teach you in university. Now, you might say, well, Leo, why are you making this so confusing? Why are you creating your own definition for rationalism, so to speak, and not using the one that they have in university? Well, see, this is really the issue of what sensemaking entails. High-quality sensemaking depends on how you draw your distinctions and how you make your definitions. You can define things in different ways, which lead to better or worse sensemaking. And if you're going to use that distinction of rationalism versus empiricism that they give you in freshman philosophy class, that's not going to get you very far in terms of your understanding of this issue, what really matters, which is the issue of sensemaking, which is why I'm redefining it and defining it in this different way. It's going to be more useful to us. See? And this is the art of good sensemaking. Of course, you're free to make your distinctions and your definitions however you want, but that doesn't mean it's going to get you very far, right? So you have to be intelligent about how you define things. So why is rationalism wrong? That's what we're interested in here. We talked about ontology last time, and this time we're going to be talking a lot about epistemology, but a little bit more about ontology is necessary here. So here's this key point. Rationalism is wrong on ontology because no quality is reducible. Rationalism tries to reduce qualities to quantities, or qualities to other qualities. What do I mean by this? Let's do a little visualization exercise to hammer this point home. If you can, do this with your eyes closed. If you can't, if you're driving or something, keep your eyes open and you can still try to visualize. So this is going to be very quick, just a minute of visualizing, nothing too crazy. Let's have you visualize some quality. So close your eyes and visualize the quality of the taste of lemon juice on your tongue. So right there, be very mindful and actually experience lemon juice on your tongue. That experience, that's a quality. And now experience something like the color red. In your mind's eye, the color red. See, that's a different quality. Now experience the number 5. 5 as a quality in your mind. And now just compare the lemon with the color red and with the number 5, and you can just experience those qualities in your mind's eye. And notice that none of them are equivalent. They're all unique, and they're all equally exactly what they are. And you can't reduce one to the other. And this turns out to be very, very important. Quality is inherent to reality. What is reality? Reality is an infinite collection of all possible qualities. And this cannot be reduced away. And these qualities are inherently subjective. The problem for science and rationalism is it doesn't know how to deal with these qualities because it wants to objectify everything and strip it of its qualities and reduce it down to something like equations or numbers. And it thinks it can do this. It thinks that it can take the color red and then reduce it down to something like wavelengths of light. And it might say, red is a certain nanometer wavelength of light. And try to equate those two things, but those two things are not equal. And no two qualities are the same. And in fact, even all the quantities of mathematics are actually qualities. If you introspect deeply and you notice what is a quantity, well, the number 5, as you just experienced, that's a quality. You need access to these qualities in order to do sense making and to do understanding. This is essential, and you can't get rid of this. It's a deep mistake to try to reduce quality to quantity, because what it does is it strips reality down and you lose the richness of the mind. This is an ontological and epistemic error. Proper use of mind requires deep awareness of qualities because you're going to be using this to make sense of things. And rationalism doesn't know how to handle this because it assumes in its ontology that, Leo, qualities aren't real. Qualities are just subjective stuff that humans have. What's real is like atoms and numbers, right? Well, that's something you have to question. Remember, that was never demonstrated or proven. That was just assumed. So rationalism ends up crushing the qualitative aspects of understanding into a flat, one-dimensional quantities, which then makes the understanding, what it's doing is it's artificially flattening the mind and limiting what the mind has access to and what the mind is able to understand. And this limits the mind's intelligence. So that's that ontological piece. Now we're ready to move on to the deep epistemology. This is where things get really interesting. So rationalism is a kind of epistemology, but it's a weak one. It has a shallow grasp of what epistemology is. It is not qualitatively rich enough to make sense of higher dimensions of mind because it tries to reduce everything down to atoms. So the rationalists will say, well, Leo, what higher dimensions of mind? There are no higher dimensions of mind. There's only just atoms in the end, right? Again, that's something that needs to be questioned, not assumed. Rationalism grossly underestimates the seriousness of epistemic problems. Epistemology cannot be solved by being more rational, formal, technical, factual, objective, mathematical, scientific, logical, mechanical, skeptical, and rigorous. But it seems like that might work, but it turns out that that's not going to work. Now, back to this question of what is really rationality? You can think of it like this. Ultimately, when we're talking about rationality, we're talking about thinking, right? Because if you're just sitting there and you're not thinking, you're not rational, nor are you irrational. You're just sitting there. You're being, that's being, you're conscious, you have experience. So to call someone irrational, what we're really saying is that they're using their mind in some sort of incorrect manner. They're thinking incorrectly. So we're ultimately talking about the structure of thinking. So this whole discussion can be boiled down to the question of what are the proper and improper ways to think? What are the wrong ways to use your mind? And notice that the mind can easily be misused. And notice that bad thinking is the norm. There's a lot of irrational thinking going on. So what is rationalism's solution to this problem? It says that good thinking can be defined according to certain rules and standards and values and priorities. Just follow this set of rules and you're going to be doing proper thinking. And if you break those rules, then you're doing irrational thinking. That's the simplistic manner in which rationalism tries to solve this problem, but this is way underestimating the significance of the problem. It's wrong because it's fundamentally question begging. It assumes what good thinking is. You have to realize that you don't know what good thinking is. That's not easy to answer. Just as a homework assignment, sit down and just on a piece of paper, try to write out a list of what counts as good thinking. How do you know what good thinking is and what bad thinking is? That's not easy to define. And this turns out to be the core epistemic problem at the heart of rationalism. Formalizing good thinking isn't just hard, it's a mistake. Because you can't follow rules for thinking, because all rules have exceptions which cannot be explicated or defined. Thinking is what we might call an infinite game, and rationalism assumes that it's a finite game. Proper use of the mind requires infinite requisite variety because the mind is infinite. Now you might say, well, Leo, how do you know the mind is infinite? Prove it to me. And of course, I can't prove it to you here right now. This is way beyond the scope of this episode and this whole series even is the mind infinite or not? You could hold that as an open question if you don't know. And that's fine. That's all good. I've discussed that elsewhere in other episodes. And I'm not going to prove it to you here. But see, part of the problem is this insistence of like, Leo, prove it to me. Prove to me that the mind is infinite. See, but then you have to go deeper and ask yourself, well, what would it even mean to prove that the mind is infinite? How would that even be proven? Is proof even capable of that? I have an episode called Why God Cannot Be Proven, which goes into great detail on that topic. So if you're interested in that, go see that episode. But for now, just take it as a sort of an assumption, just sort of stipulate for now that the mind is infinite. I said infinite requisite variety. What does that mean? Requisite variety means the flexibility of your mind. If the mind is infinite, your mind needs to have infinite flexibility in order to understand itself, is what I'm saying. Whatever formal system of rules you invent for truthful thinking, there will always be a set of factors outside of that system which governs and corrupts it. Here are some of these factors: sociology, culture, conformity, groupthink, survival pressure, financial issues, money, ego, closed-mindedness, arrogance, unconsciousness, unconscious assumptions, unconscious ontology, which you're not aware of, paradigmatic frames, lack of skill in using your own mind, lack of raw intelligence. Some people just aren't born with enough intelligence. Lack of requisite variety, lack of consciousness and self-reflection, lack of awareness of internal contradictions of your own worldview and perspective, lack of perspective, ignorance, the need to preserve your sanity, self-deception, and subjectivity in understanding and application of the rules. See, if I write down a set of rules for how to think properly, these rules are going to have to be rather fuzzy because we can't detail all of them. It would be too long of a list. And you wouldn't know how to apply this list, right? Because some of these rules are going to be ambiguous and fuzzy, going back to that notion of nebulosity. And see, because of nebulosity, we're not going to be able to define these rules. And then there's questions of like, well, how do you apply the rules? How do you prioritize the rules? What if two rules are in conflict with each other? And then applying the rules requires skill. And none of these factors can be formalized. This is something like an art that you have to be good at doing, right? It's the art of using your mind. That's what we're talking about. Mind is not limited to human laws of thinking. Thinking isn't even primary to what mind is. Now you might wonder, well, Leo, what is mind? Well, that's such a deep issue that I'm not going to define it here for you. But whatever mind is, you can imagine that extends far beyond what human thinking is. And the mistake of rationalism is to place thinking as primary. We might also call this symbolic consciousness. So we can make the distinction between symbolic consciousness and non-symbolic consciousness. Symbolic is all the thinking that you do, and then non-symbolic is the stuff that isn't thinking, which might include emotions, feelings, intuitions, but also just being itself, consciousness itself, awareness. There's a lot about you that is not thinking. The problem for scientists and deeply rational people stuck in the STEM fields is that their whole career depends upon their using their thinking intellect to do analysis, to do technical analysis. And then they get so entrained in that mode of interfacing with reality that they don't know any other mode. And that's not even the primary mode of interfacing with reality. Because your consciousness is much more fundamental than anything symbolic. For example, most animals do not have symbolic consciousness at all, yet they survive, they live lives, they're successful in their hunting and mating and everything else. So obviously, survival can happen, consciousness can happen without the symbolic, rational thinking aspect at all. So you need to be wise enough to see that thinking itself as a mode could be a trap. It's not just a question of like, are you thinking correctly? But there's a deeper question of, can thinking, period, at all, of any kind, even the best kind of thinking, is that enough to make sense of reality? How is thinking itself a trap? Is there a formal proof that thinking can be a trap? How do you prove something like that? Is there a formal proof that symbolic consciousness is just a subset of non-symbolic consciousness? You see, no. You need non-symbolic consciousness to understand that you're not going to get a formal proof for these things. That's not a mistake. That's not like a lack of rigor. That's just because you have to recognize what is driving what here. Non-symbolic consciousness is what is fundamental. Symbolic consciousness is just a little addition, a subset of non-symbolic consciousness. See? And this is something that rationalists and scientists really don't appreciate. They, of course, again, to save face, they might admit this, but they don't understand the deep implications of it and how seriously limiting this is for the entire scientific project. The irony of rationalism is that it tries to formalize thinking to reduce misuse of the mind. But this itself becomes misuse of the mind. And it takes a lot of fuzzy, intuitive, creative intelligence to notice traps of the mind. How do you formalize all the traps of the mind? Go ahead, try to do it. See how far you get. And even if you do make a list of all these traps, well, how are you going to apply this list? That requires skill. So flattening and mechanizing the mind is a trap of the mind, which stems from a fear of its inherent nebulosity and subjectivity. What is required for the proper use of the mind? Here's a list of things. First and foremost, consciousness. You need consciousness. What is consciousness? Well, that's too much to explain here, but consciousness comes in many degrees. It's not enough just to be a great thinker or a great scientist, because you can be a great scientist, but your consciousness is still not at a high enough degree to understand higher and deeper aspects of reality. What's also required is self-awareness, self-reflection, and introspection. Subjective experience of your own mind. This is irreducibly fundamental. See, rationalism and science wants to eliminate this introspective aspect, this subjective aspect, because it's fuzzy and you can't formalize it. So we're trying to objectify sensemaking and knowledge creation as scientists, but you can't remove the introspective aspect because all of the most important sense-making components exist introspectively. They don't exist out there in the physical world anywhere. They exist inside of your own mind. So this is fundamental. What's required to use your mind properly is intuitive skill. Using your mind is a skill. What's also required is asking the right questions. Asking the right questions, this is intuitive. It's not formal. There's no algorithm for what questions to ask and when to ask them. It also requires intellectual integrity and self-honesty. And this cannot be formalized or guaranteed. How do you guarantee that your own mind is going to be honest with itself and with you? You can't guarantee that as a scientist. You can be a dishonest scientist. See? Can you force all scientists to be self-honest? No. And there's many degrees of self-honesty. And are scientists even taught about the issue of self-honesty? Most scientists aren't. There are plenty of scientists who have low intellectual integrity. And again, there are many degrees of intellectual integrity. And there's not going to be any kind of formal symbolic system that ensures your intellectual integrity as a scientist. Only you can do that for yourself. And this requires using this intuitive, fuzzy skill of mastering your own mind. Proper use of mind requires the mind's awareness of its own biases and motives, and this cannot be formalized or guaranteed. Are you aware of all the biases of your mind? No, not at all. Not even close. It also requires the mind's awareness of survival, and this is a huge issue, survival. This requires crazy levels of consciousness and development to understand what survival is. No scientist or rationalist even comprehends the significance of what survival is and how it affects the mind, how it corrupts the mind and biases the mind. I've discussed that in previous episodes called What is Survival? Part 1, Part 2. And I have a third one called How Survival Shapes Who You Are. Very important episodes for understanding just this one point. See, it'll take you 10 hours of consuming that content, those episodes right there, just to understand what I mean by the importance of survival in how it shapes your sense-making. See, scientists just assume that, oh, I can just go into a laboratory and just do my lab experiments. And Leo, I don't need to spend 10 hours thinking about survival and learning this stuff you're talking about. None of this matters. Leo, none of this is relevant to science. I'm just going to go do my lab experiment. And see, simplistically, this works. You can go do that, and you might get a little quick result of your lab experiment. But if you're going to be doing science for a long time, you're going to build a whole career out of it. And you don't understand how survival shapes your own mind, all of your science is going to be corrupt. Proper use of the mind requires the skill to distinguish rationality from rationalization. That's a big difference. The mind rationalizes very easily. You can't guarantee this with any kind of formal method. As a scientist, how do you guarantee that you're not rationalizing? What I mean by rationalizing is just reasoning backwards from what you want to be true. Creating justifications for the way you need the world to be. It also requires awareness of all the self-deception mechanisms that I teach. See my 3-part series, Understanding Self-Deception Part 1, Part 2, Part 3, where we go through dozens and dozens of self-deception mechanisms. You need to understand all those self-deception mechanisms, which no scientist understands. And then furthermore, you need the fortitude, the intestinal fortitude, so to speak, to enforce those on yourself. There's no formal system that can guarantee this. That's extremely tricky. Just from this one point alone, rationalism is a failure. It can't work just because of this. But that's not it. You need a lot more to properly use your mind. You need awareness of your ego, its agenda, and its emotional attachments, and its emotional reactivity. This is huge. Because emotional attachments corrupt your entire thinking process. And if you believe as a scientist that that emotional attachments do not influence and corrupt the way that you think about science and do your science, you're completely kidding yourself. See, that right there is already a failure of rationality. You not recognizing that. Because you somehow think that you're above it. It's like, Leo, I'm a strict scientist. And, I don't care about emotions and feelings. That's like for New Age people. But see, all that reveals is that it reveals your sort of artistic cluelessness to how much your own mind is governed and run by emotions. Your entire thinking process is consumed by ego and emotions. You're just poorly aware of it, see? And the reason you're so poorly aware of it is because you've convinced yourself that it doesn't matter because, Leo, for a scientist, that stuff doesn't matter, supposedly, because we just do our strict technical science. And it doesn't matter how we feel about things. See, but you're kidding yourself. You're not understanding the depth of the problem. Because you have an emotional attachment to the very paradigm of science and to the very paradigm of rationality. You're emotionally attached to that, but you're not aware of it. And you're not aware of it because you've taken the entire introspective first-person subjective domain, and you've marginalized it as something that's not important because your ontology reduces it away to just atoms. Leo, none of this stuff is real. It's just fluffy woo stuff. The real stuff is the atoms and the mathematics. That's what's real. See? This whole line of thinking right here is the misuse of the mind that the rationalist is not conscious of, which would require deep self-reflection. So there's not enough self-reflection going on. And then that leads to the next point is to properly use your mind, you need awareness of denial, introspective awareness of your own denial, because the mind has an enormously powerful capacity for denial, which corrupts thinking. See, I could explain all this stuff to you, and some rationalist who's sitting there in university, who's really entrenched in doing his work, is going to be in denial about what I'm saying now, but not aware that he's in denial. And then he's going to start to rationalize to himself, like, oh, well, Leo's just a cult leader or something. See, that's where the rationalizations comes in. And but see, he's not conscious enough to see that he's rationalizing. He's going to think that's rationality. It's not rationality. It's rationalizing some bias you have against me and against ideas I'm sharing. See, just to deconstruct rationalism or rationality already requires enormous open-mindedness that most rationalists don't have because they're not aware of their own biases and why this is even important. You need to acknowledge as a rationalist that rationality can be in denial about truth. And formal rules and procedures cannot save you here. There are some truths that are so profound and heavy that they'll send you into an existential crisis. They'll create deep negative emotions within you, and you're not going to want to deal with those. And so in that case, what you're going to do is you're going to try to deny it, dismiss it, ignore it, go on some sort of counterattack, call me names or something, in order to deny this information. Also, what's required for proper use of the mind is radical open-mindedness, which I have episodes just about that and the importance of radical open-mindedness and what that really means and how to do it. And awareness when your mind is closing down. See, if you're a rationalist or an atheist listening to this, I say certain things and then your mind closes down, but you're not introspectively conscious enough to see your own mind closing down. And there's no formula and there's no rule book that can tell you how to know when your own mind is closing down and when to be open and when to be closed. Should your mind be open to flat Earth? Should your mind be open to reptilian conspiracy theories? Should your mind be open to God? Should your mind be open to mysticism? How do you know? Who's to say? Is there a rule book that tells you? Of course not. This requires intuitive, fuzzy, nebulous sense-making. What else is required for proper thinking is awareness of the internal contradictions in your own mind. Your mind has internal contradictions within it, but in order to see those contradictions, you got to go deep and introspect. But for the rationalist, introspecting is not important because it's all just about atoms and objective stuff out there, not the subjective stuff. What's also required is awareness of your own beliefs and the contents of your own mind in general. See, the problem is that you're not even conscious of the contents of your own mind. You don't even know all the things you believe and all the implications of all the things you believe. What's also required for proper use of the mind is awareness of interpretation. See, your mind is interpreting stuff all the time. I have an episode about interpretations. Search for that one, which is very deep and profound. Proper thinking requires seeing alternatives to your current perspective. What's the problem with all these stuffy old academics? Why do they not have the highest intelligence? It's because intellectual work is not just about going through any kind of formal procedure. It requires imagination. And imagination, one of the points of this whole episode is that imagination is a mystical, fuzzy, intuitive thing, and it's never guaranteed. You can never guarantee that some mind has sufficient imagination for making sense of reality. This imagination is necessary for you to see alternatives. For example, what's an alternative to the rationalist paradigm? What's an alternative to science as an epistemology? What's an alternative to religion? Because I'm not talking about religion. See, you have to be able to imagine that. But most people don't have that imagination. And how much imagination you have very much depends on what kind of epistemology you subscribe to and what kind of worldview you have, which comes from your culture. You have to have a willingness to question your culture. You have to have a willingness to question science and to question rationalism. Where does that willingness come from? Is there a book? Is there a formal procedure for having that kind of curiosity, that intellectual integrity, that kind of openness of mind? No. This is a very subjective thing. So rationalism cannot be used to investigate and master your own mind, you see. You can't use formal systems for exploring your own mind space. What formal system is going to do it? Is some AI going to come in and explore your own mind for you? No. Is some professor going to do it for you? No. Nobody can explore your own mind but you. So this right here kills the possibility of rationalism. This is the final nail in the coffin here. But we have many more nails. We're just beginning. We're just beginning. And you can already see how deep these problems go and how serious they are. There are no solutions to these problems from the rationalist or the scientist point of view. You cannot turn the contents of your own mind into quantities, equations, formulas, and models. And sense-making is all about the contents of your own mind, the qualitative contents of your own mind. And you cannot take the experience out of understanding. Understanding is experience. All of reality is experience. You can't reduce this away. And narrow technical understanding and analysis, the kind of stuff that they do in universities, this is not mastery of the mind. It's really shocking how scientists and academics can think that they can just go into university, never study and develop mastery of mind, and just go about doing their science. Because you see, mastery of mind is the most challenging thing that a human being can do on earth, is mastering your mind. By mastering your mind, I mean mastering your thinking, your epistemology, your emotional system as well. Everything that I teach is mastery of mind. That's what Actualized.org is. It's a series of teachings about mastery of mind. This is the most thorny, complicated, tricky, and self-deceptive topic ever. It's more complicated than quantum mechanics, right? Quantum mechanics is easy compared to the stuff that I teach because quantum mechanics doesn't threaten you, doesn't threaten your ego, whereas everything I'm teaching threatens your ego and sense of sanity and sense of reality. We're questioning everything here. So mastery of mind is different from doing science. And what scientists think is they think they can just go and spend 20 years in a laboratory, doing their quantum experiments or whatever, and that they're going to understand reality that way without first spending 20 years mastering their own mind. Because to master your own mind, that's psychology. How deeply do quantum physicists understand their own psychology? And when I'm talking about psychology, I don't just mean psychology in the abstract sense of you go read textbooks about psychology, Freud and stuff like that. No, I mean embodied psychology, right? This is a skill set. You don't just theoretically understand psychology. To master your mind, you need to actually develop the intuitive skill set of using your mind properly, effectively. See? Because all of science is happening through your mind. If you don't have mastery of mind, all of your science is going to be corrupted by that, by your lack of mastery. And no scientist or academic has mastery of mind. They don't. And you can only appreciate that by deeply studying my work. If you study hundreds of hours of my work, you'll start to understand what I'm saying there. It is not possible to understand reality without mastery of your own mind. Not just in theory, and not just mind in general, but specifically your own mind and your own issues, because you got your own, mental hangups, mental attachment, emotional issues. You got your own ego to deal with. You got various kinds of faulty belief systems and your own corruptions. All of that needs to be handled first before you can then go and try to understand deep aspects of reality. And we're not just talking about mind, we're talking about self. Mind is self. So you're also mastering your own self here. See? When you as a freshman go into STEM in academia, whether you're studying physics, biology, chemistry, psychology, anything there, do they teach you mastery of mind? Do you take a course called Mastery of Your Own Mind? No, you don't even take a single course like that. And even if you did take a single course, it would be a drop in the bucket. It would do nothing almost for actually mastering your own mind. You would need to take at least 5 years. You need to take a whole bachelor's program worth of courses just to get the theoretical foundation that you need to master your mind. And even after those 5 years, you still will not have mastered your mind. And maybe then you could go and do some serious science. But is this how scientists and academics are taught? No, not at all. Like, not even close. So are you seeing the depth of the problem here? Here's the next big point, is that rationalism fails in epistemic reductionism. So there's a parallel mistake that rationalism makes because it's so attached to this notion of reductionism. Rationalism makes the first error of, ontologically trying to reduce everything, all qualities, to atoms and quantities. So that's the ontology reduction. We've already discussed that. But then there's a parallel error that happens at the epistemic level, which is that rationalism tries to reduce all sense-making to science. And this fails because understanding and sense-making and thinking is much broader than science, and it's absolutely fundamental. It cannot be reduced to science. Rationality is a subset of understanding and thinking. Just a subset. You can think, understand, and become conscious of much more than can be symbolized, categorized, formalized, analyzed, put into rules, communicated, or explicated, or proven. You're able to understand much more than just formal logic, which is why the human mind doesn't get trapped in formal logic, for example. You can read a logical proof, and then if there's a problem in the logical proof, you can skip outside that logic, and then you can analyze it. The reason you're able to do that is because you have this fuzzy meta-intelligence that is trans-symbolic, trans-logical. Because otherwise you'd be just a logical robot, and you would get stuck very easily. You wouldn't be intelligent. Rationalism prioritizes propositional knowledge and objective facts over understanding. This is the wrong priority. See, to have good sense-making and proper use of the mind, you need to have your priorities right. Where do you learn your priorities? Is there a rule book for the right priorities? Are there objectively correct priorities? No, there's not. This is also fuzzy and nebulous. And it's more like an art than a science. See, science is so focused on knowledge that it overlooks understanding. Understanding is what's really fundamental. Rationalism tries to reduce understanding to knowledge and scientific facts, but understanding is not that. It's much deeper and more fundamental than that. And without understanding, nothing works. There's a failure in rationalism to distinguish understanding from insight and sense-making and consciousness from propositional knowledge, beliefs, and models. All of these things are muddled together and not clearly distinguished, and they're not properly prioritized. Beliefs are often reduced to just propositions and formal statements, but beliefs are actually something more than just a proposition or a formal statement, because beliefs have an emotional attachment to them, an emotional component. For example, you believe the earth is round. That's not just a proposition in your mind, like earth round, true or false, yes or no kind of thing. It's not just that. You have an emotional attachment. See, as a scientist, you really believe the earth is round, and you're really attached to that. And if someone comes along and says the earth is flat, you're going to have an emotional reaction. You're going to get triggered. Then you're going to call that person an idiot. Your mind is going to close down. Now, am I telling you the earth is flat? No, that's not what I'm telling you. It's just a simple example. Now you might say, well, Leo, so what? So what? My mind closes down. Yeah, of course my mind closes down. And of course I get upset when somebody tries to bullshit me with a flat earth theory or something like that. Of course I do, because, I don't want to be bullshitted. Right. In that example, it's kind of obvious and simple, and it may not be that important. But see, you're going to take that attitude and you're going to apply it to everything else in your life and anything, for example, that I say. And when I say something that contradicts your existing belief system and your scientific worldview, you're going to have exactly the same kind of closed-minded reaction, but you're not going to be aware of it, you see? And you're not going to care that you're not aware of it because in your mind, you got the science. You believe that you have the science and that I don't, but you don't actually know that. Again, that's question begging. For example, atheists have an emotional attachment to atheism. It's not just a strictly rational, objective, neutral kind of belief system. Look at YouTubers, atheist YouTubers, who do these kind of debates and arguments with theists. They're very emotionally attached, closed-minded people. The atheists are. Look at them. Just look how they behave. Look how their mind works. See? You don't start a giant debunking YouTube channel without having an emotional attachment to it. Of course, your whole ego and identity is wrapped up in it. You're even earning money from your channel, so your survival is wrapped up in it too. And it's like, well, Leo, so what? So what? This corrupts your entire thinking process. See? No matter how rational you try to be, you're corrupted by all those other factors. Understanding of reality is completely different from holding true beliefs or just collecting knowledge. You don't and you can't just understand reality by just reading a bunch of textbooks and getting all the true facts about the world from these textbooks. That's not how understanding works. That's not what understanding is. Understanding is a deeply qualitative aspect, internal qualitative feature of your mind. How deeply do you understand? There are many, many degrees and depths of understanding, and understanding has degrees and also breadth to it and levels of interconnectedness and holism. So it's not just this simple binary thing. How do you quantify understanding? How do you formalize it? You can't. Like not even remotely possible. And knowledge is also not the same thing as worldview. See, worldview is much more significant and important than knowledge. Because knowledge are just like individual facts. Knowledge isn't threatening. What's really threatening is when your worldview is challenged, because your worldview is connected with your identity. What do I mean by worldview? Well, for example, science and rationalism, these are worldviews. Atheism is a worldview. It's not just one belief you have. It's a whole constellation of complex assumptions about the world, ontology, epistemology, all that stuff. And most of it isn't even conscious to you. It's like an iceberg where most of it is submerged underneath your level of awareness. But then you're trying to make sense of, see, the significance of the worldview is that all individual pieces of knowledge that you encounter are fitted into, the worldview is almost like an operating system, right? So you're slotting these different pieces of knowledge into your operating system. Your operating system is what runs your whole mind, your body, everything, your emotional system. And so what if you have the wrong worldview? What if the culture that you grew up in has a poor worldview and you just grew up in it, so now you have that too? How do you begin to fix your own worldview? See, what's the formal procedure for that? Good luck formalizing that. You can't. I mean, it's just laughable. And also, knowledge is not the same thing as insight and consciousness. These are much more fundamental things, insight and consciousness. See, science is so fucking clueless that it doesn't even make these very simple distinctions between belief, knowledge, insight, consciousness, understanding. This is not taught to any scientist. No scientist or academic even understands these distinctions. This is like stuff they should have taught you in school, in elementary school. And they didn't even teach it to you in grad school. That's how backwards our education system is. So what are we talking about here? This idea that you're doing some kind of objective science, it's a joke. It's a joke. Sense-making is not just about collecting facts about the world. It's about prioritizing which facts matter and their overall significance in the larger scheme of things and how they interconnect and what they mean. Not all facts are equally important. This process cannot be objective because everyone's going to disagree about, what is significant, what's not significant, and what is significant or insignificant depends upon, of course, what your ego needs out of it. If you're a physicist, some fact is more significant to you because you care about physics and you don't care about, let's say, biology. And if you're a biologist, you hear some fact, that's going to be significant to you and you're not going to care about the physics. And you say, well, Leo, so what? Well, so what is that now, see, you have two different minds. You have the biology mind, you have the physics mind. Which one is the correct one? Which is the rational one? Which is the right set of priorities for making sense of reality? Can the biologist do it? Can the physicist do it? See? When your focus is so narrow that it's like, I decided to be a physicist. So now, mostly what I care about is just physics. But do you see how you've reduced and flattened the possibility space of what your mind is and can understand? See? You're so focused on the physics, and there's so much survival pressure on you to, do your physics research because you got a grant, right? You got to deliver on the grant. Otherwise, they're going to kick you out of university. You got to write your research papers. You got to get tenure. You got to pay your bills. So it's got all this survival pressure on you as a physicist. Do you have time to go study philosophy, study mysticism, study meditation, study spirituality objectively, open-mindedly, to study emotions, to study the feminine aspects of the mind, to study deep psychology, to study the subconscious, the unconscious? No, you don't have the time for any of this. You're in a pressure cooker to deliver, physics results. That's what they pay you for. See? You better believe this shapes your sense-making ability and even more than that, your intelligence. What I'm saying is so profound that just the fact that you have committed to being, let's say, a quantum physicist, that has already limited your ability to be intelligent already. Just because of the narrowing of the mind that happens there, and because true intelligence is actually infinitely holistic, and so you're losing holism, and that's happening all across academia, all across every domain of science, because science requires you to be so technically focused, so correct on the minutia, that the big picture, nobody is taking responsibility for the big picture. And that's one of the great downfalls of the academia system. Sense-making depends upon subjective choices, priorities, values, how to frame problems, how to interpret experiments and results, and even your genetic level of intelligence and intuition. Not all people and minds are equally intelligent or equally intuitive. There's different kinds of intelligences. And all of this plays into proper use of the mind. And none of this can be formalized or turned into any kind of system. You can't guarantee any of this kind of stuff. It's deeply fallible. See? But see, academia and formal science hates this idea of fallibility. It wants some kind of method that is infallible, which would be ideally something like, first order logic. But you can't, the things we're talking about are so high level, so abstract, so nebulous, and so chaotic and non-linear that you can't reduce any of this stuff down to anything like a first order logic. And intelligence goes way beyond any kind of formal rationality. And that informality of intelligence, the amorphous nature of intelligence, is fundamental to what intelligence is. High-level intelligence is more and more and more amorphous. This is a problem for science because science wants to objectify intelligence and just define it and put it into a little box and say, this is what it is here. And anyone who's not doing it this way, then they're not intelligent. But this whole thing that you're doing itself is not intelligent. And you don't have enough meta-awareness to see that. Here's a little bit of a few examples that demonstrate the importance of this informal intelligence. Because you've had this in your life. You can sense or intuit that something is wrong without being able to put your finger on it or explicate exactly what it is or to even prove it. So here's a few examples of that. For example, as a scientist, you can sense when a calculation is wrong. You don't know exactly why, but you just look at a calculation, you just say, that can't be right. It's too big or it's too small. And that's important because that's how you fact check your work. You can also sense that there's something off about a book that you're reading. You might be just reading a book and it's like, I get a bad feeling from this book. It's making some good arguments, but overall I just get this bad feeling. Something's wrong here. And you're not sure exactly what. But see, there's a deep intelligence within you at work that you can't quite articulate, that you're not fully conscious of, that is giving you an important insight into that red flag, red alarm, something is wrong here. And if you don't listen to that red alarm, you're going to get deluded by reading this book. Another example is that you can sense when a complex technical theory is wrong as a whole. Even though you don't understand, you can't quite technically explain why this theory is wrong, but you just feel that something about this has to be wrong. Another example is that you can sense that a research project will or will not be fruitful. How does a scientist decide what kind of research projects they're going to do? Well, of course, they're using a fuzzy intuition to decide that, that project seems like it's not going to work out, and this one seems like it will. And of course, you don't know that that's true. You could be wrong. But nevertheless, you have to be good. A good scientist is one who's very intuitive and can have good hunches about which research programs are worthwhile because, a single research program can take 10 years to fulfill. You can easily waste 10 years going down a dead end. Another example, you can sense a contradiction in a worldview without being able to articulate it. You can sense when a narrow technical research study is too reductive and therefore misleading. Like we talked about in part 1 about, the red wine research studies, red wine being good for health. You can read a study like that in online, and then you can just kind of feel there's something wrong there. Like that study is not robust enough for me to base now my health on that. Maybe it's technically true, but that doesn't mean that it's actually good for me. You can also, for example, sense when some intellectual is driven by ego. That's important, because if you can't sense that, you're going to get deluded. That means you're not intelligent. You can sense that academia is limited. That's important. Otherwise, you're going to get corrupted by academia. Before I even entered university, I was 18 years old just doing philosophy on my own. Just by doing philosophy, I already understood and intuited and figured out that the entire academic system is not conducive to truth-seeking because they have other priorities. Their priorities are, donors or the students or the faculty or whatever their priorities are, but their priorities is not the truth. I figured that out, not in any kind of formal way. Did I prove it formally? No. Is there a formal, deductive, logical proof that academia is going to corrupt your thinking process and not lead to deep truth-seeking? No. That's just something you have to intuit with your intelligence. That's not something you prove. You can sense when a person is lying to you. That's important. That's an important kind of intelligence. Can you formalize how to tell if someone is lying to you? Obviously not. You can also sense if somebody is mentally ill. If you're dealing with a mentally ill person and you can't sense, you don't have enough intelligence to understand that you're dealing with a mentally ill person, that's a very dangerous situation. Very dangerous. Watch out for that. You can sense that science and rationalism, there's something missing about those things. You can't quite put your finger on it, but you can already sense it. See? These are just some of the examples of the power of this kind of fuzzy intuitive intelligence and how essential it is for you to live your life properly to not kill yourself along the way, and even for doing science properly. Science couldn't work without any of this stuff. Here's a few more examples of this kind of intuitive understanding and intelligence. And also notice how different what I'm describing here right now is, how different it is from knowledge or beliefs. I'm not talking about having the right knowledge or the right beliefs. That's insignificant to the level of intelligence that I'm talking about here, right? Who cares if the earth is flat or round, or if the sky is blue or not, or whatever, or if the moon is made of cheese? These simplistic true or false, factual statements are really irrelevant to navigating and making sense of life. For example, have you ever tried to learn a complex piece of software, like maybe a 3D modeling application, CAD application, video editing software? For the first time when you're learning this kind of software, for me, what comes to mind is something like Maya or 3D Studio Max, complex, industry, professional 3D modeling software. I have a lot of experience with that. I've done a lot of 3D modeling. But when you're first learning something like Maya or 3D Studio Max, like there's so many buttons and toggles and settings, and how do you figure out how to model something in 3D Studio Max? Like it's a process of complicated trial and error and intuition. There's no formal rule book that you can read to understand how to do good 3D modeling. You have to actually go in there and tinker around and figure stuff out. And as you're clicking on different settings and you're experimenting and you're making a bunch of mistakes, you're using your intelligence to figure out, okay, this doesn't work, this works, oh, this kind of works, but I need to adjust it this way. Is there any way to formalize that process? Absolutely not. See? And this is completely different from knowledge and beliefs. I mean, it's like knowledge and beliefs are like child's play compared to what I just explained to you right there. Just that example. Or, for example, if you're a computer programmer, you can sense, if you're an deeply experienced computer programmer, you can sense that if you're designing a complex piece of software, you're going to have these kind of decision points about like, what's the right architecture and design overall for some big piece of software that we need? Should we design it this way, or we can design it this way, or we can design it that way? And there's different pros and cons to these different designs. They have different levels of robustness. They'll take different amount of time and work to implement. And so a highly paid, very experienced, masterful software engineer is going to have enough intelligence, and it's going to be a very nebulous, fuzzy kind of intelligence to understand why he gets paid the big bucks. People like this earn millions of dollars a year because, somebody comes to them and say, hey, we need this kind of complex website made, or this kind of complex software made. And this engineer has so much experience and intelligence that he can say, well, you know what? You shouldn't use this design. You should use this other design because this design will be more robust, 10 years down the road. Because it's very hard to think and to anticipate the consequences of some software architecture 10 years down the road. See, that's true intelligence. And none of that can be formalized. None of that is strictly logical. Can this software architect, can he formally prove that this design is going to be better? No, of course not. It's way too complicated for that. Another example, you can sense, if you're in the business world, you can sense when someone's going to screw you over in a business deal. And this is essential. If you don't have this kind of intelligence in the business world, you're going to get cheated and robbed and screwed, and you're going to go bankrupt real quick. If you're not savvy to these kind of, scammers, and kind of cheats and frauds in the business world. There's many of these kinds. How do you codify and formalize this kind of intelligence? I mean, it's impossible. It's just a feeling you get. When you're sitting face to face with somebody in a business deal, you can feel if this is somebody you can trust. And of course, your feeling is not always correct. You can be wrong. All of this is fallible. There's no guarantees here of correctness. But even though it's not guaranteed, it's still better than any kind of following of rules. See, if you sat down at the beginning of every business meeting and you went down like a list of 10 rules, follow these 10 rules to make sure that no one fucks you over in a business deal. If that's what you were doing, you would get fucked over in a business deal. Why? Because the guy who would be fucking you over would read your 10 rules. He would know that you're following those 10 rules. And then, of course, he would find a loophole in those 10 rules, and then he would screw you over. So if you were following those 10 rules very, rigorously, thinking that, well, this is how I'm going to protect myself by following these 10 rules. See, this is the essence of the problem of rationalism. They're following these 10 rules, thinking they're protecting themselves, not realizing that the guy on the other side has already outsmarted this whole system. And they don't have enough requisite variety. This is what requisite variety is about. The mental flexibility to see that following these rules is not going to be enough to protect you. This is a microcosm of the larger issue that I'm talking about here. Everything I'm talking about is explained in this one example. Here's another example. Imagine I give you some kind of container. It's a locked container, but it's not locked under a key. It's just got like some kind of lid on it. But this is a foreign kind of container you've never seen before, and you're not sure, does the lid screw this way? Does it unscrew that way? Maybe you have to slide it this way or that way. Maybe you have to do something how do you open this container? So what I'm saying, that true intelligence is the ability to open this container. Is there a formal set of rules that you're following to open this container? Of course not. There's no way you could formalize this. But it takes intelligence to open this container. That's truly what intelligence is. Not an IQ test, not your ability to do math, or not your verbal abilities. This is real intelligence. The amorphous nature of this intelligence is exactly what makes it so powerful. Because see, it's got such a high requisite variety that it's able to outsmart the problem. That's what intelligence is. It's your ability to be more flexible than the problem that you're up against. And if you're following rules, that limits that intelligence. How about, as an example, understanding that something you said hurt your girlfriend's feelings? See, that takes intelligence. And that's why a lot of these autistic science, nerds, they're very bad with women. Why are they bad with women? Because they're just talking logic and she's not operating on logic, and they don't understand she's not operating on logic. And they say something logical that hurts her and they don't even understand that they hurt her. That's not intelligent. That's stupid. If you can't tell that your words are hurting your girlfriend, that's fucking stupid. And as a last example, understanding a dangerous situation. Imagine there's a dark alleyway in the city. And you're about to walk down that dark alleyway, at midnight, and then you just have this weird feeling, and then you turn around and you walk away. See, what I suggest to you is that that's intelligence. That's real intelligence. Because you can't formalize, you don't know, you can't prove that there's a robber or, a psychopath at the end of that alley, but you just know something is off about this situation. You don't know exactly what. You can't put your finger at it all, but you are intelligent, and that is what keeps you alive. And people who do not have this intelligence, they will walk down that alley and they will get something bad coming to them. See, that's real intelligence. Actually, I'll give you another example. This happened to me just this week. I ordered something on Amazon. As I do, I get a lot of Amazon packages. So I got this package, and it came in a kind of, baggy envelope. It wasn't a box. It was just a little baggy envelope. I went to the post office. I took the bag, and as soon as my fingers touched the bag, I immediately, within a fraction of a second, understood that, this is the wrong thing. Amazon sent me the wrong item. Just because through the bag, I felt the thing inside the bag, and I immediately knew that this does not correspond to the thing that I purchased. That's intelligence. Now, how do you quantify and formalize that? See, this is the core problem for rationalism. You can't. Now, see, the scientists and rationalists will now say, but Leo, sure, I agree with you that these are important things, but Leo, we're not this stupid, we're not this robotic. Of course, Leo, as a scientist, I also have this ability to do what you're doing. Yes, of course you do. Of course you do. I'm not saying you don't. Of course you have this ability. My point is that you don't understand the significance of this ability and what it really is. how important it is. And ultimately, you don't understand that this is actually a mystical ability. See, you think that this ability is just neurons and atoms. It's not. It's a mystical ability. Intuition is a mystical ability. Intelligence is a mystical ability. But your worldview doesn't accommodate that. And it's going to take more and more hours of me explaining this to get to the point where you're going to be able to understand that it is a mystical ability. So stick with me. If you're skeptical, stick with me. We still have a lot more material to cover. Imagine, here's kind of like what rationalism is. Rationalism is like this. A rationalist sees an Olympic level ice skater skating around, doing pirouettes and beautiful ice skating routines. And then he thinks to himself, she's really good, but I've been sitting here and analyzing her moves and I've written down a bunch of rules. I want to make her a better ice skater. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to figure out, I'm going to analyze how she's skating, and I'm going to attach numbers to things, and I'm going to say, that's this and that's this. I'm going to attach formulas to it and all this kind of stuff. And then I'm going to write this fat manuscript of all the right ways to ice skate. And I'm going to present this to her, and I'm going to say, here, learn this, and you're going to become, a great Olympic ice skater. You're going to start winning gold medals from this. And of course, this is stupid, right? Because that's not how ice skating works. Ice skating is a deeply embodied intelligence. It's a skill set. It's experience. It's intuition. If you're going to be following rules for ice skating, you can ice skate that way, but you're going to make very mediocre ice skaters. You're not going to create Olympic level ice skaters like that. And so the same thing is happening in universities. Universities are teaching students and indoctrinating students into these kind of formal systems of thinking and reasoning, because that's what creates kind of a safety zone, an intellectual safety zone, where, students don't go off into crazy crackpot conspiracy theories and all sorts of, fantasies and delusions and nonsense. And so it kind of creates a container of safety, because, a university needs to preserve its reputation. They can't have tenured crackpots and conspiracy theorists. They need to have serious, intellectuals who follow the rules, so to speak, and don't say crazy things. So what they do is they train students to have very narrow, rigid minds to fit within the parameters of what the university needs for its survival agenda. And this ends up creating mediocre minds. What I'm saying is that even at MIT and Harvard and Caltech and Yale and Princeton and Stanford, that the minds there, these are all very mediocre minds. Even the minds who are getting Nobel Prizes, these are all very mediocre minds by the standards of intelligence that I'm trying to teach. And that's why we need to deconstruct this whole fucking thing. Understanding and sensemaking is like surfing. Formalizing it makes it less intelligent. Here's a few more powerful examples. Consider chess. Notice that a chess grandmaster does not play by any kind of rules. Chess is a deeply intuitive game, especially at the highest levels. If you're playing against a, Magnus Carlsen or a, Hikaru Nakamura, like, look at how intuitive these guys are, like the crazy levels of intuition. That's what makes them chess grandmaster geniuses, and nobody else can reach their level. See? Because there's no set of simple rules you can follow to become a chess grandmaster. Why not? Because if you were following a set of rules, then your opponent would just learn the rules that you're following and then outsmart you using your own rules. See? That wouldn't be intelligent. So true intelligence is so amorphous that it's like you're surfing on the edge of a wave, and it's dangerous. There's a danger to it, right? And this is why true intelligence cannot exist in a university system, because it's so dangerous that you're always on the razor's edge, and you could always slip and fall and break your neck. or you could be a genius. Here's another powerful example. Imagine the problem of handling nuclear weapons. So, we've got nations, let's say US, Russia, have large nuclear stockpiles. We want to, of course, protect ourselves, right? We want safety. We want security. We can't just have, people willy-nilly, pushing buttons and sending nukes wherever they want, right? We need, you would think like, how do we create a nuclear system where it's, it's locked down tight and there's no chances of any kind of mistakes or errors? This is kind of analogous to what science is trying to do with knowledge. We don't want any delusions. So in order to do that, you might think, okay, so how would we do that? Well, we don't want to just let people use their intuitions to just feel like, they feel in danger, and then they push the button and they send a nuke. We don't want that. That's very dangerous. So you might say, okay, we need a formal procedure. So we're going to create, a step of 10 rules that we're going to train everybody in this nuclear bunker that, manages this nuclear stockpile to, follow these rules. First you got to do this, then you got to do that, then you got to do this other thing. You got to check with that guy over there, and he has to put his rubber stamp on it. And then, it's this bureaucratic process. And in this way, you think we're going to save the world from nuclear annihilation, right? Wrong. Why? Because the intuitive element turns out to be fundamental. Why? Because let's say you're a nuclear operator, you're sitting there, you're looking at the radar dish, and the radar is showing that, oh my God, Russia has just sent a nuclear rocket is, hurtling towards the Washington, D.C. And you're sitting there as, the radar operator, and you start to panic, and you got these rules to follow. Now you got to follow the rules. Well, the radar dish shows that there's clearly a missile heading towards Washington, D.C. But see, what your rules don't capture is that maybe there's a bug in your radar, computer system, operating system, and it's a false positive. It's showing that there's a missile, but there actually isn't one. It takes human intelligence, fuzzy, nebulous intelligence to intuit that, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense. Why would Russia right now, we're not at war with Russia. Why would Russia be sending a nuclear weapon and why would they only be sending one? It doesn't make sense. If Russia was going to do a full-on, nuclear attack on us, they would probably send 100 missiles at once. They wouldn't just send one rogue missile at Washington, D.C. That doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. But your rules don't capture that. See? And this operator needs to be able to understand that and to be able to say, wait a minute, maybe my computer there's a glitch in my computer. Maybe it's malfunctioning. Let me go open it up and check and see if there's a bug in the machine. And sure enough, there's a bug in the machine and there's no missile. And look, we saved the world from nuclear annihilation. Whereas if we followed those fucking rules and the rules said, if you see a missile coming to us and, a certain number of minutes pass and the missile is still coming, if the rules say that, and then the rule says you got to retaliate, and then you retaliate at this false positive and then you destroy the world. See? That's why true intelligence cannot be formal. Because if it was, we'd already have killed ourselves as a species. Intelligence is required to understand that something is a special case of a more general pattern. So for example, you need intelligence to see that Newtonian mechanics is just a special local case of a much more broader general relativity. That's not something obvious. This is not just knowledge. This is not just a fact about the world. This requires intelligence to see that. Intelligence is necessary to recognize higher orders of unity. This example that I just gave is one of these examples of recognizing higher orders of unity. Feelings, sensations, intuitions, consciousness, insight, hunches, mental images, vision, analogies, imagination are irreducible parts of sensemaking. Even though superficially a rationalist or a scientist would say, yeah, Leo, I agree with you. We're not really denying that. But I'm saying, yes, you are denying it. You don't understand the depth of what I'm talking about. The implications of it are so enormous. Yes, I'm not saying you have no imagination whatsoever. as an academic. You have some imagination. But what I'm talking about is moving you towards infinite imagination. That's fundamentally what academics lack, is imagination. And that's what true intelligence requires, is imagination. It's important that you start to notice that your mind does not operate by scientific method. This includes scientists themselves. I'm not just talking about normies. I'm talking about scientists. Scientists do not do science by scientific method. And this is not a trivial matter. This is highly significant. Because you actually couldn't do good science by strict scientific method. In addition to that, your mind also does a lot of highly irrational stuff, even if you are a scientific and rational person. And you cannot wall off your scientific work from your mind at large, because science is only a small part of your mind. Rationality cannot be equated with scientific method because scientific method is itself undefined. It's not how science is actually done. It changes and evolves over time, and it is unknown if that method, as it is currently formalized, is sufficient to capture all of reality. It is actually irrational to equate rationality with science because science is full of untested assumptions, falsehoods, closed-mindedness, ego, human bias, corruption, and unknown unknowns. Yes, this brings us to unknown unknowns. This is what destroys the possibility of rationalism. Quoting David Chapman, quote, "Unknown unknowns are relevant factors you have not considered at all and cannot be incorporated into any formal system," end quote. See? Rationalism and science and academia can deal with known unknowns, but it can't deal with unknown unknowns. And yes, this is coming from the kind of famous Donald Rumsfeld speech of, known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And even though, of course, Donald Rumsfeld was a devilish character, he was right in that speech. There are such things as known unknowns and unknown unknowns, and it's the unknown unknowns that really get you. And so, see, the problem with rationalists is that their imagination of the possibility space of what is in the unknown unknowns is so narrow and limited that then they're not able to make sense of the mystical aspects of reality and consciousness. They call that stuff woo. They're allergic to it. They're closed-minded to it. The reason that is because they have a failure of imagination to see just how advanced, creative, imaginative, and intelligent reality really is, because they assume that reality is just a bunch of dumb atoms. It all goes back down to that assumption. And we're just now seeing the consequences of that assumption play out in this crazy way. See? So, for you rationalists and atheists, what real mysticism is, I'm not talking about religion. I'm not talking about fundamental. I'm talking about real mysticism. What real mysticism is the unknown unknowns in your worldview that you lack the imagination to even imagine yet. See, you're underestimating reality. You're underestimating how intelligent reality really is. And therefore, you're assuming that your little simplistic models are sufficient to account for it all, and it's not. And you're closed-minded to that. Okay, the next point. Understanding is inherently qualitative. Rationalism says that if it can't be quantified and made into an equation or measured, then it isn't real. But rich qualitative understanding is realer than mathematics. It is not enough for understanding to stick to the facts, evidence, proofs, and just being objective. Understanding is not just logical or factual. It's emotional, it's imaginative, it's visionary, and it's inspirational. Understanding has an aesthetic aspect to it, aesthetic qualities, which no equation and no logic can capture. And then ultimately, that's what art is about. And you cannot distinguish art from science. Science is an art. And you cannot distinguish fact from the aesthetics of understanding, because the aesthetics of understanding are what get you to new facts and new understanding of the world. So rationalism misses the mystical nature of understanding and trivializes understanding by removing the qualitative aspects from it. And the quality of understanding is highly significant because it matters, because it leads to other, higher, deeper understanding, which then recontextualizes all of the facts and all of the data. Rationalism wants to take the skill out of understanding to make it formal, mechanical, objective, guaranteed, and foolproof. This is a mistake. Because understanding also requires connecting dots. You can think of understanding as connecting dots in your mind. There are many, many dots to connect. You can connect them in infinitely different ways. There's no one right way to connect these dots, and there's no system of rules for how to connect these dots. Which dots to connect, how to frame the dots in your mind. See, connecting dots is different from holding a belief. It's different from knowledge. To be very effective at connecting dots requires a live, proactive, creative intelligence, vision, wisdom, synthesis, interpretation, relevance, realization, meaning, perspective, values, priorities, focus, self-reflection, bias awareness, ambiguity, decision-making, consciousness, skill, insight, intuition, openness, and deep experience. None of which can be formalized. To understand the highest aspects of reality requires interconnecting so many dots. And if you fail to interconnect the dots, your mind becomes ossified and rigid and stuck. That's what the academic mind is. It's a failure to connect all the right dots. And this is really deepened as a problem because academia is so specialized into silos. The knowledge and the departments are all siloed, which prevents a sufficient connecting of these dots to reach the highest levels of mystical intelligence and understanding. The higher your intelligence rises, the more mystical it becomes. The reason in university it seems like, Leo, there's no mysticism in the university, and university professors, they seem quite intelligent, so what you're saying doesn't make sense. Well, it doesn't make sense because you're underestimating the total scope of intelligence. See, when your intelligence is rather low, what it is at MIT and Harvard and Yale and Princeton, all those places have low intelligence. So if you have low intelligence, then that intelligence is rigid, ossified, materialistic. It's literally reductionistic, pragmatic, scientific, and there's no mysticism there. Yeah, because it has sucked all the imagination and creativity out of sensemaking. And then if you want to reach true intelligence, you go outside the academic system and you really start to try to understand reality. Then you interconnect more and more dots, and then your whole system, your entire mind becomes very, very fluid rather than rigid. And then you start to access mystical levels of consciousness and understanding. Okay, next major point of why rationalism is wrong is because sense-making requires insight. Insight is fundamental. Formal systems are incapable of insight. Insight is only something that is subjective to your mind. A computer doesn't do insight, at least not yet. And no logical system does insight by itself. No mathematics does insight by itself. All of mathematics hinges on human insight. Insight cannot be formalized. You can't predict when insight is going to happen. If you're wondering what insight is, go see my episode called What is Insight for more on that. Insight cannot be reduced to algorithms, math, equations, calculations, movements of atoms. None of that is equivalent to insight. Insight is qualitative. All insight, no matter how minor or mundane, is mystical. This is what all rationalist scientists and academics miss. They don't understand that insight is mystical. This includes all scientific insight. Therefore, science cannot be distinguished from mysticism. Technically, it can't, because you require mystical insight to do science. There can't be science or mathematics or even logic without this. This is technically true, but the rationalist is convinced that science is distinct from mysticism and that science is true while mysticism is false. This is a mistake. This is a self-deception. And this is why rationalism must be deconstructed. Now, some smartass will come in here and say, well, Leo, but what about AI? Can't AI do insight now? We've got these fancy AIs these days, ChatGPT, can it do insight? Well, that's an interesting question. I'm not saying that computers can never do insight. I'm not saying that. They can, but first of all, I would dispute that ChatGPT does true insight. That's something, we have to get really deep in the weeds. It's going to take us too much off track. So I'll have a separate episode about AI that we talk about that kind of stuff. But for now, first of all, I'll tell you, you should question what, it's not at all obvious that AI does genuine insight, first of all. Second of all, here's the real point, is that even if your AI can do insight, that doesn't disprove what I'm saying, because if it's doing insight, it is mystical, right? So what I'm saying is that you can have mystical computers. That's not a bug, that's a feature. The AI is mirroring the human nervous system and the human, neuron structure and all that. So potentially you could sort of, learn to reverse engineer the human mind and start to generate real insights. But the reason that's happening is because your computer itself is part of consciousness. It's part of the universal consciousness system that your own brain is a part of. This is something, again, that the materialists don't understand, because the materialist thinks that, Leo, a computer is just like a dumb box made out of atoms. There's nothing mystical about a computer. No. Everything is mystical. You can't see that, because to see that everything is mystical, you need to have an infinitely unified mind, which you don't, because you've subdivided your mind. That's what we're trying to correct. But we haven't finished correcting that yet. So let's keep correcting it. The next major problem for rationalism is that rationality cannot solve the problem of recognition. The problem of recognition. What is this? Well, see, I'm giving you God damn it. The things I'm saying here are so profound that I'm telling you it'll take you 10 fucking years to appreciate what I'm saying here, because this is so dense. This is so condensed. Any one of these points that I'm saying should blow your mind. Look, I've talked about this before, but I have to talk about it again to connect it to everything here. Most animals cannot recognize themselves in the mirror. That means that when a donkey is looking at itself in the mirror, it does not know that that's me in the mirror. It doesn't make that connection. Why? Contemplate why this is happening. It's happening because obviously it's lacking intelligence. Why is it lacking intelligence? It's lacking intelligence because it's lacking consciousness. It has less consciousness than a human. Only animals with sufficiently high consciousness and self-reflective capacity and intelligence, therefore, because intelligence just comes with higher consciousness automatically, are able to recognize themselves. That recognition, what is that? That's not knowledge. That's not a belief. That's not a thought. I mean, it can be a thought, but it's more than just a thought. It's a recognition, fundamentally. See, when you look in the mirror and you recognize that as yourself, like, oh, that's me in the mirror. As a scientist and rationalist, you look at that and you're like, well, so what? Leo, big deal. No big deal. It's a monumental fucking deal that you're able to do that. How are you able to do that? This is a mystical process. Your mind is performing a mystical process. And you're not conscious that it's a mystical process. You are as unconscious of this as a mystical process as the donkey is unconscious of his own reflection in the mirror. The donkey doesn't recognize his own reflection, and by extension and parallel, you as a scientist and rationalist don't recognize that this process of self-awareness is mystical. It's like, Leo, no, it's not. Yes, in the same way that if you tell a donkey, that's you in the mirror, he'll be like, what? What? What are you talking about? Leo, prove it to me. I'll prove it to you when you can prove to the donkey that he's looking at himself in the mirror. Prove it to the donkey. Let's see how you prove it. See, this is the double standard of rationalism. Is rationalism conscious of this double standard? No, because it's not conscious of itself. Understanding reality requires more than knowing atomic facts. It requires recognition, deep self-recognition, pattern recognition. Pattern recognition is not objective and formal. And what I'm talking about, when I say pattern recognition, that is important. But when I'm talking about recognizing yourself in the mirror, that is more than pattern recognition. You say, Leo, computers can do pattern recognition. Yes, they can. And that does make them more intelligent when they can do that. However, self-recognition is not just pattern recognition. It's way beyond that. And recognition is essential for understanding, sense-making, and intelligence. And so this kind of recognition, this doesn't just apply to the mirror example, because you might say, well, Leo, so what? A donkey can't do it, but a human can do it, so what's the big deal? Well, you have to be a little bit more imaginative than that. You have to think ahead, and you have to see if the donkey can't do it, but you can do it. By extension, what is it that you can't do that some higher mind can do? But likewise, you can't understand it in the same way that the donkey doesn't understand what he's missing, and you don't understand what you're missing. I'm trying to guide you and point you towards a higher dimension of mind that you're completely ignorant of. In the same way that you might try to guide the donkey into recognizing himself. And then you see, but then you ask for proof. Leo, prove it to me. Prove to me that the mind is infinite. Leo, prove to me that it's mystical. Prove to me that intelligence is more than just a bunch of rules and a bunch of atoms in a box. A bunch of calculations and neurons. Prove it to me. You're not appreciating how delicate this matter is. You can't, your notion of proof is so gross and so inadequate for the rich kind of understanding that we're talking about. And you don't recognize that. And that's why you're stuck. You're stuck at that stage of cognitive development, oblivious to higher stages. Okay, the next major point of why rationalism fails is the problem of understanding implications of facts. See, what's more important than having a belief or a piece of knowledge or a fact is understanding its implications and significance, which is non-formal. Here's an example of what I mean. You might be a naturalist or a biologist studying different species, and you might go to South America, study the species there, then you go to Africa, study the species there, and then you notice yourself, wait a minute, I've traveled all around the world. I've been to Asia, to the polar ice caps and Europe and everywhere in between, the Americas, and but the species in the South America and in Africa, they're very similar, unlike anywhere else. I've never seen this kind of correlation before. It's like, wow, how could that be the case? And then you get a little kind of hunch. It's like, wait a minute. And then your imagination kicks into gear and you say, wait a minute. Could it be that these were actually on the same landmass at one point, millions of years ago? And then boom, you have this crazy insight that, you know what? South America and Africa, they were connected millions of years ago. And that's why these species are related to each other. And it's like, whoa, you just made a gigantic, scientific discovery, which is what Darwin supposedly did. And so, but see, what's the point here? The point here is that, see, I could just give you the facts of what species live in Africa and what species live in South America. These are just like the raw facts. But the raw facts don't tell you the significance of any of this information. It requires a deeply intelligent mind to look at the facts and say, wait a minute, how are these connected? Connect the dots, have some kind of insight, see the implications. What's the implication of this animal having this tail and this animal having this beak, and they're related to each other? What's the implication of that? There's no formal method for how to arrive at these implications. This just requires raw intelligence. Another example, the orbit of Mercury is a bit eccentric and different than the other orbits of the planets in our solar system. And in the early 20th century, there was, there's this anomaly, this kind of mystery about why is the orbit of Mercury kind of eccentric and it kind of processes like this. Why is this happening? It's like Newtonian mechanics, everything we know about physics up to that point tells us that this shouldn't be happening. We should be able to predict the orbit of Mercury better than we're able to. So there's kind of anomaly there. What's the implications? See, a good scientist says, well, what's the implications of that? But what are the implications? Where do you go to ask, who do you ask for the implications of that? Are the implications of that Newtonian mechanics is wrong? Is that the implication? Is the implication that our understanding of time is wrong? Our understanding of velocity is wrong? Or maybe the implication is that, our measuring instruments are not very good. Something's wrong with our measuring instruments, the way we're measuring it. Or maybe there's a mysterious unknown planet that we haven't discovered yet, close to the sun, that is somehow disturbing this orbit. Or maybe there's a little moon, a little asteroid around Mercury that is kind of, jostling and warping the orbit a bit. Maybe it's that, and we haven't just seen this asteroid yet. So how do you know what the implications are? And the implications, see, it requires imagination to be able to imagine weirder and weirder implications. And of course, reality is a very weird thing, much more weird than anybody expects or imagines. And so just like literally scientists do not have enough imagination in many cases to imagine these implications. And if they do, like Einstein did, if they do, then we call him a genius. That's what a genius is. See? So genius is non-formalizable. You can't get an Einstein by following rules. What you get by following rules is you just get a standard, boring, stuffy, old academic hack who just does mediocre science and doesn't make any Einstein-level breakthroughs. For example, right now in physics, there's a deep problem. We have quantum mechanics, which seems like a pretty successful theory and model. And then we have general relativity, which is pretty successful as well. But these two things do not mesh with each other, and they contradict each other in important ways. Now, the question is, what are the implications of that? That's not easy to answer. Whoever answers that question successfully is going to win a Nobel Prize and is going to be remembered forever in history. And so far, no one's been able to crack that nut. Why not? Because they don't have enough requisite variety. Their mind is too rigid. Their mind is thinking in terms of models, in terms of atoms, in terms of waves and equations. And to solve that problem, you're going to have to probably think in much more creative ways than that. See, don't you see that the intellectual successes of science are exactly its greatest obstacle? Because you create these models like Newtonian mechanics or general relativity or quantum mechanics, and then it seems to work pretty well, but it doesn't completely work. Doesn't explain everything, doesn't account for everything. There's anomalies. And then people are so educated under these models that their minds literally can't think in any other way. And it takes a genius to come in there and to think in a creatively new way to break down that whole paradigm. This is the whole history of science in a nutshell. Here's some more examples of implications. I'm just going to say phrases, and then I'm going to point to implications. So like the sociology of science. What are the implications of the sociology of science? The implications are enormous. I've discussed them elsewhere in my series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science. See? But does any scientist understand the implications of the sociology of science? No, they don't. That takes way too much imagination. How about ego? if you really know what ego is, what are the implications of ego for science, for academia, for sensemaking? That's enormous. I can have a whole 10-hour talk about that. Does any scientist understand the implications of ego? No. How about groupthink and conformity? I just released a 4-hour episode about the psychology of conformity, it's called. What are the implications of conformity? They're incredible, incredible. No scientist comprehends the implications of conformity and groupthink as it pertains to the doing of science and academia. How about this thing I just explained about the animal not being able to recognize itself in the mirror? What are the implications of that? Almost nobody understands. What about psychedelics? What are the implications of psychedelics for scientific work? Almost nobody understands. What about when I say something like reality is infinite or it's unity? What are the implications of infinity and unity? Virtually nobody understands those implications. That requires such a deep interconnecting of dots, such profound holism, such imagination and creativity. Now you might say, but Leo, scientists consider implications all the time. You know, after all, Einstein did solve the problem of the mercury thing, and Charles Darwin did realize the implications of the different species and, discovered evolution. Look, yes, scientists do that. It's just a question of degree. Scientists are doing a little bit, and I'm talking about doing a lot more, and that's it. We're just trying to advance it. Now, rationalism tries to save itself here by cordoning science off as a narrow technical field. What the rationalist really wants to do is he wants to say, look, Leo, yes, there's all these other aspects of the mind. There's intuition, and there's feelings, and then there's weird hunches and stuff that you have. That's all over here, and then technical science is over here. And we shouldn't confuse the two. But this fails because there is no crisp boundary between science and life and science and sense-making. Your science is always framed and couched within the context of life and sense-making and mind and self. Science is always taking place inside of a self. There is no science outside of a self. And no scientist understands this. Of course, superficially they understand it. If you just tell it to them, they'll say, yeah, of course, obvious. But so what? But see, that but so what attitude is exactly the problem, because you understand the things I'm saying superficially, and you're not going to understand where it's ultimately leading to. When you understand it superficially, it doesn't change your mind. It doesn't change anything. You stay stuck as you always were. That's why we're talking about this for 10 hours, so you can get the depth of it. You cannot say that hard science is all that's technically true. That is technically wrong. Hard science is not all that's technically true. Science exists within mind. Science is a special case of mind. You cannot separate thinking in general from science. The mind is a general sense-making understanding system with no boundary between that and science. Truth, understanding, and reality exist beyond the construct of science. It is a mistake to subordinate sense-making to science. Rationalism's fundamental mistake is that it assumes the mind is a formal system because of the success of math, physics, and engineering. It tries to treat the mind as just a computer, but the mind is not a computer. A computer is a special case of mind. And the rationalist doesn't understand this. And he doesn't want to understand this. You see, it's not enough to just understand stuff. You have to want to understand it. And you don't want to understand it. And the reason you don't want to understand it is because it's too painful for you to understand it. You're emotionally attached. And you don't even understand why you're emotionally attached. And the reason you're emotionally attached is because your entire sense of self and sanity is entangled with your sense of reality, which is entangled with science. So when I stripped science out of your mind, it's going to feel like you're going mad. That's not a mistake. That's correct. All understanding of reality flows through the bottleneck of your mind. Just that one statement right there, do you understand the significance of that? Nobody does. Due to unconsciousness, you do not know the contents of your own mind and your thinking process. To think properly requires awareness of your own mind's internal subjective dynamics. These are internal factors which cannot be externalized, quantified, or formalized. Proper thinking is inherently irreducibly subjective for this reason. Proper thinking requires first-person introspection. Because everything is filtered through your own self and experience. There can be no algorithm or formal rules for this, because how would you know what the right process is? And how would you have the skill to execute it? For example, let's say as a rationalist, you've diligently studied the cognitive biases, right? You know them all by heart. Okay, good. But how would you know if you're applying the cognitive biases to yourself? This requires self-reflection, introspection. This requires first-person internal experience. But here's the contradiction, is that rationalism denies this. It calls all that stuff woo. That's all woo. But you need that woo for proper use of the mind. Rationalism cannot function without woo. You need intuition to get understanding going. You need to intuit that the scientific method is valid. You intuit that the universe is rational. But, of course, intuition is fuzzy and fallible and subjective. The contents of your mind can never be made explicit. That's why rationalism fails. You do not know all of your beliefs, assumptions, motivations, biases. Your own ontology is unknown to you. You are not conscious of the consequences of your own beliefs, positions, and worldview. You are not conscious of the internal contradictions of your worldview. The rationalist doesn't even know whether rationalism is internally consistent, because that requires a deep self-reflective consciousness, which is dismissed as woo. Therefore, you cannot objectively assess your own mind's coherence or consistency, which is necessary to be truly rational. See, one way to think about what rationality is it's having a coherent, consistent mind. If there's contradictions in your mind and in your worldview, then you're being irrational. That's one perspective on it. Well, but how can then you claim that you're rational if you don't have full consciousness of all the internal contents of your own mind? Because what I'm saying is that there are contradictions in your mind, but most of them are below the surface of the water as the iceberg and below your consciousness. The mind can think of itself as rational without seeing its own irrationality because the consequences take effort to explore and to see. It doesn't just happen spontaneously. It requires curiosity, motivation, passion, imagination, effort, and work. And then what if you're lazy and you don't want to do the work? Well, then you're going to be deluded. And what if you're closed-minded to doing the work? What if you believe the work isn't important? What if you believe it's not significant? Well, then you won't do it, and then you'll remain deluded. See, fundamentally, your mind doesn't know itself. And yet, you're trying to use this mind to do proper thinking and to do science and to make sense of reality. This is delusion. How do you know you're applying logic properly? You can't use rules for this, because how do you know that the rules are true and that you understood the rules and applied them correctly? There's no escaping your own judgment and authority. As you're trying to make sense of reality, at some point, you can't just keep offloading responsibility onto others. See, this is kind of what science wants to do. Science wants to act as though, like, Leo, we're not being subjective. We're not making any judgment calls here. All we're doing is we're just letting reality dictate the facts to us. And then we're just reporting the facts. But that's not how the mind works. Because even to say that, Leo, all that my worldview does, my worldview is not fantastical. It doesn't make anything up. My worldview is very simple. All that I do is I study the facts and I report the facts to people. That's all my worldview is. See, that entire thing right there, that's a judgment. That's a judgment you're making about yourself and about your own worldview. Is that true? How do you know it's true? Or if you say something like, Leo, everything you're talking about here is just bullshit and none of this matters. None of this is important to science. See, when you say that, first of all, you haven't proved that. That's not a scientific statement. But also, when you're saying that, you're exercising your authority. So you're putting your foot down and you're saying, this is what's true. And then you're believing it and you're acting based on that. But you could be wrong about that. How do you know that you're rational? What if you tell yourself that you're rational, but you're lying to yourself? Or you tell yourself that you're rational, but you're not conscious of the contradictions that would reveal the irrationality. No formal process can capture this. The next major point is that rationalism completely overlooks the force of survival in shaping the mind, understanding, and truth-seeking. See, science and rationality are subordinate to survival, not to truth. Survival is what frames science. Science is taking place in the frame of survival. This is so fucking significant that you would need to go watch all my survival episodes that I mentioned earlier in order to understand what I'm saying here. But in brief, survival biases reasoning. There's no such thing as reasoning in the abstract outside of survival. That doesn't happen. And as we said, rationalization is a thing. And most of what people call reasoning is actually rationalization, which is a very dangerous conflation. Reasoning is never neutral, unmotivated, nor objective. Even scientific reasoning still serves survival, maintains identity and sanity. See, no scientist understands this. How much of science is playing a function of maintaining the integrity of the psyche and its sanity. It's not just that you're going to lose science, you're going to start to lose your sanity too. And when you start to lose your sanity, you're going to forget all about science and academia. You're going to get very terrified and you're going to crawl into a fetal position and you're going to call for mommy. That's what's going to happen when you start to lose your sanity. Science can't save you from that. Only proper sense-making can save you, which is outside of science. Survival completely distorts your thinking process about everything. Science and rationality cannot be isolated from survival. And because of this, rationalism cannot solve the issue of corruption. See, what we're really talking about here is corruption. Survival is what corrupts the mind. But if you're not aware of survival, as scientists and academics are not, or if you convince yourself that it's not important or that you've somehow transcended it when you haven't at all, then you are unable to see what corruption is. So science and academia doesn't even recognize what corruption is. Science is blind to its own corruption. Is there a formal scientific process to prove that science is corrupt? No, of course not. The very essence of corruption is that it's fuzzy and messy and chaotic and sneaky. It doesn't just announce itself to you. You have to uncover it because it's hidden. Also, rationalism does not contend at all with ego, and ego governs everything your mind does. See, rationalism doesn't understand the centrality of psychology. Scientific people think that they can just do science isolated from psychology. It's like, no, all of science is happening within the frame of your own psychology. And also the collective psychology of everyone in your university or academic system or scientific field. Rationalism doesn't understand that. Psychology runs sensemaking, not logic, not truth, not reason, not science. And formal systems, formal logical systems, do not have psychological awareness. All the tricks of psychology, no formal system tells you this. Here's an example. A formal system doesn't have a way of handling denial. So there's no way of breaking out of denial if you're in denial as a rationalist. See, you can be a strict materialist atheist scientist, totally in denial about the things that I'm trying to teach you, but you have no way of noticing your own denial and admitting it to yourself because you're denying that the things I'm talking about are important. You're literally denying the importance of denial to the centrality or the function of science. See, you think you can just do science and not care about denial. No, that is denial. Ultimately, no human is rational because a human is a survival machine, and there's nothing rational about you surviving at the expense of someone else. Do you see this? Contemplate this question. Is survival rational? See, the rationalists will just say, Leo, of course survival is rational. It's rational for me to live. This is a very limited view of what rationality is, because of course your ego considers its own survival as rational, when technically it isn't. See, there's nothing irrational about you dying. There's nothing rational about you reproducing. There's no reason why you should live and others can die. But see, you favor your own survival. You favor the survival of your career as a scientist over the careers of other colleagues of yours. See, when it comes time for budget cuts in your university department, who's going to survive, you or your colleague? You're going to select you, of course, even though maybe your colleague does better work, is more truthful than you, is more hardworking than you, but are you going to admit that to yourself? No. And you're going to rationalize to yourself that you're being a rational scientist. And you're going to say, well, Leo, none of this is pertinent to my science. But it is. But it is. Rationalism leads to double standards, which are in fact contradictions, biases, and a lack of rigor. Any of these kind of double standards that I'm pointing out within rationalism, if they persist in your mind, that's a lack of rigor. Okay? And it leads to irrationality and an inability to comprehend higher realities. Okay, next major point of why rationalism fails. Sense-making and truth-seeking require epistemic responsibility. Epistemic responsibility cannot be guaranteed because it must be self-enforced. How do you formalize epistemic responsibility? You can't. And you can't understand reality and avoid self-deception without insane levels of epistemic responsibility. And so see, one of the simple problems for scientists and academics is that they are not nearly epistemically responsible enough. See, if you were truly epistemically responsible, you couldn't silo yourself into a narrow field like, quantum physics or, molecular biology or whatever, organic chemistry. Because when you silo yourself into organic chemistry, that's all you're going to really understand. You're not going to have to take epistemic responsibility means that you have to actually study a lot of different fields. You can't just specialize in one narrow technical field because you recognize that if you do, you might get stuck in that. See, epistemic responsibility is what forces you to go out there and read books about psychology, sociology, spirituality, mysticism, God, religion, woo stuff, new age stuff, paranormal stuff, science, politics, human nature, right? Why? Because you know that you need as broad of a view as possible to be able to see blind spots within your own worldview, to master your own mind. This is all, you need to read all these books to master your mind. You can't master your mind without this. See, but if you're just working in organic chemistry, you put the blinders on and you say, Leo, I don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. I gotta turn in my research study tomorrow. Otherwise, I don't get my next grant. Otherwise I don't get my PhD. I don't get tenure. Leo, I can't worry about that stuff. I got to get my tenure. See? And already you've corrupted yourself without even understanding how you did it or why you did it. Okay, the next major thing of why rationalism is wrong is this. Rationalism cannot solve the problem of self-deception and illusion. Rationalism assumes good faith actors. But what if you have untruthful actors, deceivers? How will you catch them? Why is this relevant? Because we're talking about sense-making. Sense-making and truth affect power and survival. These are very dangerous games that are being played here. Right? You're not just out there searching for knowledge in a neutral sense. Your ability to even search for knowledge depends upon somebody financing you. Money. Money is survival. Nobody gives you money unless you scratch their back, unless you give them power in return. They give you money, you give them power, you give them status, you give them something in return. And the academic or scientist says, well, Leo, I don't care about that. That's not part of science. That's like politics stuff. I'm just going to put my head in the sand and just do my lab work. And Leo, after all, look, it works. I've published some papers. I've made some discoveries. Look, Leo, it works here. Leo, what you're saying here doesn't change my science. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Even the fields and the topics that you're studying, you're only studying those topics which you can get grants for, which your university thinks is valuable. If your university doesn't think something is valuable, you won't get a grant for it. You won't be able to teach it. And so your mind is limited even by the things that you're selecting as to focus on. And then your mind is rationalizing to itself that, oh, well, Leo, it's not that important. I would have studied this anyways. No, you're studying it because that was the path of least resistance. That's what you could get a grant for. You're not studying it because this is really what's important to study to make sense of reality in its ultimate sense. See, you don't care about that at all. A scientist is not taking epistemic responsibility for understanding ultimate reality because they don't teach you that as a possibility in university. See, you don't even, as a scientist, you don't even have enough imagination to realize that it's possible to understand ultimate reality. You can't even imagine that. You're not creative enough. You're not open-minded enough. Because after all of the people around you, all your colleagues, they're not doing anything so arrogant as trying to understand ultimate reality. They got their nose to the grindstone, just grinding away in the laboratory, on organic chemistry or something like that. But what is this organic chemistry going to do? Why are you studying organic chemistry? What's it going to do for you? Is it going to help you understand ultimate reality? No. So then why are you doing it? You don't even know why you're doing it. Ultimately, the reason you're doing it is because you haven't imagined something better to do. And probably because of conformity, because you went to school and some teacher influenced you and you thought it was cool. See, back to this issue of self-deception. You can't even assume that the mind cares about truth, which rationalism assumes. Your mind doesn't care about truth. It cares about survival. Your mind is not an honest actor. Your mind lies to itself, fudges issues, rationalizes, bullshits, ignores, denies, has biases. It's emotional. there are dozens of self-deception mechanisms that you must be conscious of to think properly, which is difficult, iffy, fuzzy. Even for people who have been studying this stuff for 10, 20 years like I have, it's very iffy. For example, how do you know that you're not doing confirmation bias and projection as a rationalist? Or for example, how do you know that you've been charitable enough in understanding an opposing argument? For example, let's say you're an atheist and you're arguing with a theist. See, the atheist is so unaware that it doesn't even occur to the atheist that maybe I'm not being charitable enough and serious enough in understanding the theist's position. And so the atheist just goes debunking and arguing in a sort of a Richard Dawkins kind of way. Right? See? It doesn't even occur to Richard Dawkins that maybe he hasn't put in enough time and effort to understand the opposing argument of what he's arguing against. Because he doesn't have enough self-awareness, because he's just assuming he's correct. And the reason he's assuming that is because he's completely self-deceived. And the reason he's self-deceived is because Richard Dawkins believes that science is just the truth, and that all of this psychology stuff and all of this woo stuff, it's completely unrelated to doing good science. You can just do good science and understand the world without needing to get into all this deep psychology. And that's wrong. That's a self-deception. See, how do you know, as a rationalist, whoever you're arguing against, that you are not being closed-minded and egotistical? See, you don't know that. And of course you are. Rationalism does not take seriously that the mind lies to itself. How can rationalism have an objective set of rules for handling the ego's tricks? Notice that catching lies and deceptions requires intelligence, and this cannot be formalized. You always have to read between the lines of what is explicit when you're dealing with a liar, because the liar doesn't explain everything to you. See, when you're dealing with a formal system like mathematics or first-order logic, the reason those systems can work in a formal way is because there isn't the possibility of lying and deception in those systems. See? First-order logic doesn't lie to you, but your own mind does lie to you. In order to successfully navigate lying and deception, you always have to read between the lines and look into the implicit, not the explicit. Because the liar, by definition, is doing something implicit. And the liar will exploit any formal system against you. Now you might say, well, Leo, so what? What does that have to do with anything? Well, your own mind will deceive you using your own formal system. And the rationalist doesn't understand this, doesn't take this possibility seriously. Here's the key insight, is that deception is informal. The ego's tricks are informal. And the ego exploits formality. If you create a formal scientific method for getting to the truth, the ego will find ways of corrupting that method and turning it into falsehood. Why? Leo, why would it do this? Because everything your mind does is about survival, not truth. You're assuming your mind cares about truth. It doesn't. It only cares about survival. So as soon as your mind is able to find some way to corrupt something in order to increase its own survival, it's going to do it. And you're not going to be conscious of it. See, Richard Dawkins doesn't understand that his atheism and scientism is a part of his ego and identity. He thinks that doesn't matter because he already assumes that it's just true. And therefore, Leo, if it's just true, it's not really part of who I am in my mind, and I'm not really defending anything because it's just true. but it's not true. That's an assumption that it's true. Actually, it's a fantasy in your mind that you're defending. That isn't true. That's why he's defending it. But he's not conscious that he's defending it. And he will deny that he's defending it. And then when I tell him psychology is important, you should go study psychology for 10 years to realize how you're fooling yourself, he'll say, that's not important to science. Leo, I'm just a scientist. I don't need that. And when I tell him, you got to go study some metaphysics and some epistemology, he'll say, that's not important to science. That's for philosophers. Leo, all you got to do good science is just be strict about you doing your science. Follow the rules. Follow the scientific method. And that's all that there is to it. You don't need to think about the ego's tricks. See, imagine for a moment that the universe had a devil in it who could trick people with illusions. See, if that was true, I'm not saying it is true, I'm just saying if that was true, as a thought experiment, rationalism does not have a solution to this scenario, and therefore it just assumes it's impossible. Well, I got news for you. Self-deception and illusion are total, and they include rationalism as part of that. Contemplate this possibility. Is it possible to use rationality to deceive yourself? If you say no, then you fail to understand your own mind. And if you say yes, then what's the solution? See, the rationalist thinks that by being formally logical and rigorous, that this will save him from self-deception. But this grossly underestimates what self-deception is. Self-deception is so much more intelligent than that. See, in a sense, you're in a battle between your own intelligence and the intelligence of the universe that is trying to deceive you. And so the rationalist just ends up following this kind of formal process. You follow all the proper rules and methods, but in the end, the problem is that the rationalist is still lost in Maya and run by the ego, and lacks the creative intelligence and imagination to break through these illusions. There's a lack of connecting of the dots, a lack of holism, because of this stupid insistence on reductionism, ontological reductionism and epistemic reductionism. And so rationalism becomes the self-deception that formality will save you from self-deception. Why can't formality save you from self-deception? Because it turns out that reality is an illusion, and the illusion is spun by an infinite intelligence. It would be dumb if formality could save you from an illusion, because the illusion is infinite, and formality is finite. What we're dealing here with Maya. If you're not familiar with this concept of Maya, go read about it on Wikipedia, so you just have the basic idea of it. But Maya is the idea that everything is a dream. You're in a dream. See, and rationality is insufficient to escape Maya, because rationality is part of Maya. Maya has co-opted rationality. See, but the rationalist, the only thing the rationalist can do here is the rationalist can say, Leo, but Maya, what is this? This is some sort of hippie new age woo concept. There's no such thing as Maya. Prove Maya. There's no Maya. What are you talking about? See? And then how do you prove Maya to a person like that? Do you see the level of, it's such a profound level of lack of self-awareness, lack of seriousness in these kind of rationalist people. It's just fundamentally unserious. Does not take Maya seriously. See, if you took serious epistemic responsibility and I told you about the concept of Maya, you would first of all go on Wikipedia and read about it. Then you would deeply contemplate it. Then you would realize, holy shit, this is a very powerful, profound concept. And holy shit, if Maya is true, I have to rethink my entire understanding of reality, epistemology, ontology, and I have to take self-deception extremely seriously. See, and then that would be the beginning of your path towards awakening from Maya. Does a scientist do this? No. See, the scientist just goes, it's like, Leo, Maya, that's a distraction. I need to publish my research papers. I can't sit here thinking about Maya for 10 years. I got to publish research papers. I got to get, I got to teach my students. I got this giant backlog of reports and papers to grade. I don't have time to think about Maya. That's some kind of irrelevant thing. But see, you don't know what's relevant and what's irrelevant. See, you're just intuiting. You're using some kind of fuzzy intuition to say that something is irrelevant. And of course, that's fallible. The rigor of rationality in science is part of Maya. That's part of the illusion. It's the illusion of rigor. See, in reality, the technical scientific mind is just an unconscious survival machine put in the service of knowledge generation, like a yoked mule. That's what a scientist is, without realizing he's a yoked mule, serving a master. What master is he serving? Well, there's multiple levels to it. It could be the, university system or the ego mind. The scientific technical mind is not truly intelligent because it has not become conscious yet of its own mechanicalness and the force that truly runs it, its master, which is survival, of course. A scientist doesn't even understand the master he's working for. If you don't understand who the master is in this relationship, if you think science is the master, well, that right there, you're already a fool. Science is not the master. Survival is your master. Rationalism's ontology assumes that the world is finite, rigid, straightforward, and linear, and then tries to develop a linear autistic mind to match that kind of ontology. But since the ontology is wrong, as we've explained earlier, then this kind of mind ends up being wrong. See, it turns out that mind is infinite, nonlinear, nebulous, qualitative, chaotic, implicit, works in gestalts. It's visionary, it's imaginative. And the implicitness is essential to infinity, whereas explicitness is essential to finitude. And science is all about, and rationalism is all about being stuck on explicating everything, explicitness. By being, stuck on explicitness, you end up getting stuck to finitude, and then your mind becomes finite. And then you lose track of infinity, which is exactly the whole problem here. For more on this idea of explicit, implicit, and the significance of this, go watch my deep episode, very good episode, called Explicit versus Implicit Understanding. Okay, the next major point is that rationalism fails because of not knowing. Look at this. Nobody knows what anything is. None of the primitive concepts that make up objects and understanding were ever known, as we've discussed in part 1. This is always the case, but the human mind needs and demands that things be known for the purpose of survival. This requires making assumptions. These assumptions are necessary to bootstrap science and understanding. But these assumptions are mostly unconscious, so rationalism fails because it does not have access to all of its own assumptions. And one of those assumptions is that everything real is rational, scientific, and quantifiable. Identifying assumptions is not a formal or guaranteed process because it depends on self-awareness, a subjective and skillful thing. You need skill, subjective, personal skill, and mastery over your mind to be able to identify the core assumptions of your worldview, of science, of rationalism, of atheism, of materialism. What are all the assumptions of rationalism? What are all the assumptions of science? See, a rationalist couldn't tell you. I told you earlier in part 1, I told you some of those major assumptions. And there's more. But they couldn't tell you this because they haven't studied this stuff deeply. You'd have to study this for 10, 20 years to understand all the assumptions. See? And these assumptions, they remain hidden from you by an intelligent force. Your own mind is hiding your assumptions from you. And if you just assume that the universe is dumb and your mind is just a bunch of neurons and atoms, then you don't anticipate that it could actually be crafty and clever and trying to trick you when you try to figure out the truth. See, the scientist thinks that figuring out the truth about reality, there's nothing tricky about it. You just go and measure stuff and you'll figure it out. Again, that's an assumption. What if reality is clever and sneaky and it's spinning an illusion on you for some sort of deeper purpose? What would that purpose be? Well, that purpose would be your survival as a self. That's the purpose. See? What if there was no self? What if there was no human self? What if there was no science? What if there even wasn't a material universe, but that it only exists as an illusion spun by a creative intellect? What then? What then? See, these scientists and academics don't take any of these, they haven't considered any of this. They don't care. And the reason they don't care is because they don't take epistemic responsibility. And the reason they don't take epistemic responsibility is because they're not serious about truth. They don't care about truth. They care about science. Caring about science is not the same thing as caring about truth. Questioning assumptions requires psychological motivation for doing so. Formal systems do not have motivation and intention. Questioning is a subjective feature of the mind. Questioning comes in many degrees of quality. There are no formal rules for how to question reality. What you know, of course, depends on the kind of questions you ask, and there are many qualities of questions. Asking the right questions is paramount in truth-seeking and sense-making. And asking these powerful, correct questions cannot be formalized. A major problem for scientists and academics is that they are not asking the right questions, which limits their understanding, cognitive development, and truth-seeking. You have to also believe that the questions are worth asking. A lot of the philosophical, deep questions that I tend to ask, if I ask them of a scientist, he would think that these are like insignificant, unimportant, trivial questions that don't have an answer. They're not even wrong. They're just meaningless. But here's some powerful questions you should start asking as a scientist and as a rationalist. How is science a self-deception? See, that's a powerful question. That's the right question to ask. Or, what are the assumptions of science? What are all the assumptions of science? That's a powerful question that almost nobody asks. Or, for example, what if there exists something beyond rationality? Just contemplate that. Or contemplate this. What if human sanity is too limited to understand reality? Or contemplate this. What if truth cannot be reached by thinking? What if quality cannot be reduced to quantity? What if others are imaginary? What if reality is just a giant hallucination? What if scientific method limits intelligence? See, these are some powerful questions that would really point you into a deep exploration of the nature of reality and your own mind and self. But what if you subscribe to rationalism and scientism and you're so busy as an academic that you believe that these questions are nonsense or that they're delusional or they're just a waste of time, and so you don't ask them? And see, as a scientist, you might say, well, Leo, demonstrate to me, prove to me that these are important questions that I should be thinking about. No, you see, it doesn't work like that. I can't prove that to you. This is all in such a fuzzy domain that we're way above this kind of ability to formally prove stuff to you. I can't prove to you that you should be contemplating whether reality is a hallucination or not. You need to be intelligent enough to intuit that that's a good thing for you to contemplate, and that might have some bearing on how you do your science and how you do your sense-making and your atheism and your materialism and so on. See? The next major point is this: there's always the issue of proper focus, since your focus is limited and reality is infinite. And there's no objective answer of what you should be focusing your mind on, right? You could focus your mind on organic chemistry for the rest of your life. What's going to be the consequence of that? Is that an intelligent thing to do? Is that what you should be doing with your mind? Who's to say? There's no objective rules for determining what the wrong focus is or what the right focus is. And then look at this. Look how interesting this gets. This creates the possibility then for distraction. See? Because if the ego mind wants to spin an elaborate illusion, what it can do is it can exploit your weakness in focus to keep you distracted and self-deceived. Because all you have to really do to self-deceive yourself is just throw yourself into a narrow technical field like organic chemistry and just study organic, convince yourself that organic chemistry is the only important thing and that's all you're going to focus your mind on for the next 50 years. If you do that, the ego mind has succeeded in creating an illusion of a self as an organic chemist. And then you're going to survive as that organic chemist. And you believe that that's what you are. You're a human organic chemist living on planet Earth. And you believe that is scientific, and that's just an objective truth and fact, and that's it. And there's no need to do philosophy about this. Leo, that's just how it is. See? Your ego has tricked you with this distraction. I'm not kidding. For many academics, their entire academic career is just one giant distraction, spun by their ego to avoid serious truth-seeking. Now, how do you convince someone in that situation that that's their situation? Do you see how painful that would be for them to admit? Do you see what kind of denial they're going to be in? Do you see what kind of rationalizations they're going to engage in? Do you see how closed-minded and arrogant they're going to get? How egotistical and how emotionally butthurt they're going to get when they hear that from me? And they're going to click off the video, and then they're stuck in their illusion forever. See, distraction cannot be solved by formalism. And science and academia is mired in the wrong focus and distractions. All sorts of technical minutia as distraction. Also, formal systems cannot make executive decisions, and sense-making requires making executive decisions. What's an example of an executive decision? Well, for example, should you become an academic? Or should you do your intellectual work outside of academia? That's an executive decision. How do you decide which is the correct path? Well, there's no, of course, objective answer. You could do it both ways. But of course, there's also pros and cons. But most minds are quite bad at making these executive decisions. And these executive decisions are almost always governed by survival concerns, not truth seeking or science. It's by survival concerns. See, why did you even decide to become a scientist? That's an executive decision that you made. See, you could have been a philosopher. You could have become a meditator. You could have become a Buddhist. You could have become a mystic. Why'd you become a scientist? Obviously, because you find that meaningful and you believe that's something important. In fact, I would suggest that you believe that's the most important, because if you thought something else was more important, you would probably be doing that thing, right? If you thought philosophy was more important than science, you'd be doing philosophy. And if you thought Buddhism was more important than academia, you'd be doing Buddhism. But you're not. See? But how did you make those determinations? Did you prove it? Have you proven that Buddhism is less important than science? No, that's not a scientific statement. And yet, see, now your entire mind is operating from that scientific domain. If you went into science, now you have a conflict of interest because you're part of that system. Your survival depends upon it. And you don't want it. It's very painful to admit you were wrong. It would be very painful for an academic who spent 40 years in academia to admit that, you know what? You know what I should have done is 40 years ago, I should have just been a Buddhist for 40 years. Fuck. That's very painful for the ego to admit. What academic is going to admit that? Another important point is that thinking is analogical. Thinking is analogical. What does this mean? Well, to really understand this, you'd have to read Douglas Hofstadter's book called Surfaces and Essences, where he talks about the analogical nature of thinking. But basically what it means, his thesis of that book, and the whole book is just filled with examples of analogical thinking, but all thinking requires seeing similarities and differences between things. I can't go too deep into that here. I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. For example, if you start studying physics, they'll tell you that photons are waves. That's analogical thinking. Is a photon really a wave? No, it's not. A photon is a photon. And it's not technically a wave, but we say photons are wave-like. That's analogical. We see an analogy between a photon and a wave, and we therefore tend to equate them. Or for example, in physics, they'll tell you that electrons, they're considered things or objects. Now, technically, is an electron an object or a thing? Not really. If you really look at what an electron is, it's not a thing. It's not like a little particle that moves around. It's really a probability distribution. Is a probability distribution an object or a thing? Well, we could kind of say that, in a fuzzy, intuitive way, we can say that. We can treat an electron as a thing, even though it really isn't a thing. But we treat it that way because we see some kind of similarity and we think analogically about it. For example, if you're a scientist doing, biology research, developing some new medicine, you tend to think and equate, humans with rats. Because if it works on a rat, you'll think, oh, it probably will work on a human. If it works on a chimpanzee in my lab, it'll probably work on a human. So you make analogies between, humans and rats. If you're a psychologist studying humans, then you'll make analogies between different humans. You'll treat humans as similar to each other or the same. You'll tend to think of that, well, if it works on that human, the psychological thing, then it'll probably work on that human as well. Even though, of course, are humans all alike? No, but we treat them analogically similar. If you're a rationalist or an atheist, you might say, oh, Leo is just like a Deepak Chopra. See, when you say Leo is like Deepak Chopra, you're drawing a connection, an analogy there. Or when people call me a cult leader, oh, Leo's just a cult leader. See, an analogy is being drawn by your mind. Is Leo really a cult leader? Well, see, you have to have a concept of a cult leader. You have the concept of Leo. You have to somehow connect them in your mind, draw an analogy between them. Is that analogy true? To what extent is it true? Did you prove it? Is it scientific? Or for example, when I start talking about mysticism, someone listening to this who's very, atheist might say, well, mysticism, that's just religion and superstition. See, so now you're drawing an analogy between mysticism, religion, and superstition. So your mind works on drawing samenesses and differences. I have an episode called Sameness versus Difference, which goes into great depth on that topic. But the point is that the reason that rationalism fails is because there is no objective criteria for right and wrong analogies, because sameness and difference turns out to be relative and subjective. These are not objective facts about the world, whether two things are the same. Is a photon a wave? That's not an objective fact about the world. That's an analogy your human mind came up with. Is Leo a cult leader? That's an analogy your mind came up with. That's not a fact about the world. That's not a scientific fact. Is an electron an object? That's not a scientific fact. I really didn't do this topic justice. You need to go read Douglas Hofstadter's book. It's a long book. It's a deep book to really appreciate what I said here. So the problem is that you can reason correctly and still have totally wrong understanding, worldview, paradigm, asking the wrong questions and not seeing the big picture, lost in the technical details. And this is an undeniable fact, is that rational people get reality wrong all the time. Ask yourself, why? Why hasn't rationalism solved this problem? And what good is rationalism if it still gets reality wrong? How do we really solve this problem? Well, of course, the problem is that rationality is easily misapplied. There's no method for how to properly apply rationality. No formal method could be deduced from atomic facts. And when you think that you are following a rigorous logical system towards, truth-seeking, and that's what your worldview is, that's what your science is, then you end up being very certain, much more certain in yourself than you should be. And you become arrogant and stubborn and dogmatic, and you turn into a Professor Dave type character. That's what he is. He's the embodiment of that. Because his mind has convinced itself that, hey man, I'm just doing objective science over here, and you're talking about some sort of weird cult woo stuff over there, and it has no bearing on science. And none of that is important to science. Just, you're irrational and I'm rational. And it's just that simple. See, his mind has convinced himself of that. And that is the self-deception to which he's not conscious of. Because he's not taking epistemic responsibility. He's not treating Maya as a serious possibility. None of this that I'm talking about is a hypothetical issue. We have a history record of science. We have a history record of rationalism failing. Research, logical positivism, logicism, behaviorism, these are some of the strands of science and logic and math where rationalism failed, definitively failed. What are the epistemic lessons from these real historical failures? Well, here are some of the lessons. Rationality overestimates its own power. Rationality is arrogant, closed-minded, and pig-headed. Rationality is not aware of its own assumptions. Rationality is not enough to solve self-deception. And rationality does not take enough proactive epistemic responsibility. Those are the main lessons that I draw from those historical examples. All right, now, trying to think, should I take a break here? I'm going to take a quick break, and I'll be back, and we'll continue on. All right. Now I'm going to present 5 performative contradictions of rationalism. What is a performative contradiction? A performative contradiction is something in a philosophical worldview that contradicts itself when actually put into practice. So for example, if you say, sometimes people say, well, truth doesn't exist at all. That's their worldview. There is no such thing as truth. But is that true? That's a performative contradiction, because just to make the statement that there is no such thing as truth is already a truth statement. So you're contradicting yourself. Another performative contradiction, which is common amongst postmodernists and relativists, is you want to say something like, well, everything is just relative. But if everything's just relative, then your perspective that everything is just relative must also just then be relative, which undermines itself. That's a performative contradiction. Or if you want to say that, well, all cultures are relative. There's no one correct or good or best culture. So we just have to respect all the different cultures equally. Okay, well then what if you have a culture that wants to not respect all the cultures and wants to destroy all the different cultures? Do we have to respect that culture too? The postmodernists would want to say, no, you don't respect that culture. But if you really truly want to be relativistic about it, then you have to respect that culture. And then that culture will destroy your culture. So you get the idea. All right, performative contradiction number 1 of rationalism is this. Rationalism likes to posture as though it's rigorous, more rigorous than it really is. So it plays a trick on this concept of rigor. Rationalism aims to solve self-deception by being hyper-rigorous and formal, but this was never proven as the solution to self-deception. How do you solve the problem of self-deception? That's an open empirical question. You can't just assume that. To be truly rigorous is not to assume the answer. If you assume the answer, you're being sloppy, not rigorous. But rationalism assumes and clings to the answer, thereby making itself actually sloppy and not rigorous. See? So the self-deception here is that the rationalist thinks he's being rigorous. He's not. He's actually being sloppy, but it's in the form of looking like rigor. So it's the illusion of rigor, you see? But the rationalist isn't conscious enough to see the illusion, which is why we talked earlier about the power of Maya and the importance of being able to transcend illusions, see through illusions. Because see, here's what the rationalist doesn't really consider, is that reality might be such a thing that being hyper-rational doesn't solve self-deception, but actually feeds into self-deception. And that is indeed the case. That is indeed the intelligence of Maya is such that it co-opts a simple-minded rationality. But rationalists, of course, are in denial about this. Scientific people are not truly rigorous because they assume too much and because their rigor makes them very technically narrow in their scope of what they're trying to understand and make sense of. And when you're doing that, you can't be rigorous by being so narrow because sense-making is about breadth and about totality. The totality is critical. True rigor means questioning all scientific assumptions, taking nothing for granted, questioning also rationality and its application, questioning human sanity, questioning whether your ideas of rigor are truly rigorous, or maybe it's just a trick. See? Being truly rigorous means being open-minded to mystical woo, too. Clinging to science and rationality is not true rigor, it's technically sloppiness. But how many scientists and academics and rationalists understand that and are willing to admit that to themselves? Not very many. Performative contradiction number 2. Rationalism criticizes other paradigms for not being sufficiently formally proven. Rationalism purports rigor as the measure of truth. But rationalism itself cannot be rigorously defined nor proven, so it fails at its own standard. If truth is equivalent to proof, by its own standards, rationalism is not true. How did rationalism ever prove itself as a paradigm? The key insight is that it didn't. It never formally proved itself. Rationality was adopted intuitively because it can't be formally proven. You can't formally prove that everything true is rational. No one became a rationalist from formal proof. No one became a scientist from formal proof of the validity of science. That's not how scientists are born or made. People become rationalists and scientists because it seems reasonable to them. It seems like it ought to work. And generally speaking, it does work. For simple problems, it generally works, although it even does fail in those cases too. But then when you start to expand your epistemic responsibility to try to understand all of reality and not just some narrow sliver that you artificially carved out for yourself as a scientist or as an academic, when you truly try to understand the entire universe, so to speak, then these simple-minded approaches, they all fall apart. Performative contradiction number 3. Rationalism wants to claim that the only thing that's real is the hard scientific facts, the atomic facts. However, rationalism itself is not a hard atomic fact. You cannot get the validity of rationalism from studying atoms. You can study physics till you're blue in the face for your entire career, and physics will never tell you anything about how paradigms work, how the mind works, how self-deception works, what an illusion is, what cognitive biases are, the importance of epistemic responsibility, what truth-seeking really is. See, none of these are atomic facts, and yet all of these are fundamental to proper sense making, of which physics is just a little part, a little part. Hard science cannot prove the validity of rationalism. Notice that rationalism itself is not a reductive primitive. Rationality is a higher order abstraction. You don't go out into the physical world and find rationality. You can't point your finger at rationality. Rationality is not atoms. It is not equations. It is not calculations. It is not neurons. It is not the brain. It is not itself a crisply defined object. See? There's your contradiction right there. The fourth performative contradiction is that rationalism claims to be rigorous and strict, yet rationalists are very closed-minded about what they refer to as woo. Mysticism, religion, spiritual topics, paranormal topics, this kind of stuff. However, to be truly strict and rigorous is to admit profound not knowing, which means having an open mind about mysticism and woo and the paranormal and spirituality and idealism and solipsism and God, because you don't truly know. But this is not the position that rationalists take. So rationalism acts like it's strict and rigorous, but it does so with a materialist bias, with a certain ontology, with a certain epistemology, with a certain paradigm. And so it's rigorous in its attacks on other paradigms, but it is not rigorous when it comes to introspecting about its own position, its own assumptions, its own biases. Now, true rigor and true strictness would be to come from a position of total not knowing and zero bias about anything. And that means you don't favor atoms over God and mystical stuff. You treat them equally. See, that would be true rigor. But that's not how academics behave. So true rigor is extreme open-mindedness and even-handedness, which is what I embody and demonstrate in my work. It is my work that's actually truly rigorous. Because to be truly rigorous, you have to be able to explore everything: science, religion, spirituality, philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, psychology, sociology, politics. This is true rigor. Not to lock yourself in some scientific department and only study quantum physics. That's not true rigor when it comes to sense making. And to minimize sense-making and understanding into something narrower, like, for example, scientific method or the pursuit of knowledge or the doing of technical research. That is not true rigor. But that's difficult for scientists and academics to admit to themselves because they've invested 20, 30, 40 years into that kind of narrow-minded intellectual pursuit. See? How many scientists and academics, if they understood what I'm talking about, would be and they kind of, let's say you came to a scientist or an academic, and they fancy themselves as being truth seekers, right? No academic would say, well, I don't care about the truth. But my claim is that the academic doesn't actually care about the truth. How can I make that claim? Well, based on the following point, is that if you come to most academics and scientists and you tell them that, you can't do truth-seeking within academia doing this narrow technical work that you're doing. So you'd have to quit academia and do your work outside of academia. How many of them would be willing to quit? How many of them would quit science, quit their careers? Most of them wouldn't. Why not? Because they have an emotional attachment to it. They're invested in it. See, their survival is tied in with it. They've invested 30 years of their life into this. So are they going to admit to themselves that they wasted 30 years not actually doing genuine truth-seeking? No, they're going to rationalize to themselves that they are doing truth-seeking and that what I'm talking about doesn't matter. They're going to say, Leo, you're being way too pessimistic about academia. Of course, truth can be found within academia. That's how they're going to rationalize it to themselves. And they're going to say, Leo, all the stuff you're talking about here, we already know about all this stuff. Leo, you're not saying anything new here. You see? Do you see how survival co-opts your sense-making process? And it co-opts then science. So yes, it's fundamental to science is survival. And so in practice, what you find is that rationalists are very closed-minded and biased when you actually start to debate them. See, they like to act reasonable. What academic and scientist doesn't seem reasonable on the surface? They all seem reasonable, superficially. But when you start to drill them on epistemology, on ontology, on spiritual topics, on mysticism, you'll see how quickly their mind closes down and they will not be able to comprehend the things that are being talked about. Because deep down, they're very closed-minded, and their academic, bureaucratic system that they are attached to and survive within has normalized that level of closed-mindedness because they consider that rigor. That's just scientific rigor. Leo, I have to be a very careful, rigorous scientist. I can't start buying into this woo stuff that you're talking about. That's too far out there. Yep, and that limits your intelligence. But you have to go deeper and ask yourself, why am I committed to this bureaucratic system? Why am I doing sense-making using the academic system? Where did I get that idea? Did I prove? Was it ever proven that the academic system is sufficient to understand reality? No. You never proved that, and you never will prove that. You just assumed it. It just seemed reasonable to you. So are you seeing how all of these different points that I've been talking about, individually, they might seem like kind of nitpicky or technical or not very significant, but when we all combine them together, you start to see the significance of it. Performative contradiction number 5 of rationalism is that rationalism claims to be hard, objective, a sort of a facts don't care about your feelings philosophy. And yet, rationalist strictness is an egoic reaction against the fear of fantasy and delusion. If you truly introspect as a rationalist, then you ask yourself, why am I so rational? Why am I so anti all the woo stuff? It's because you're afraid of fantasy and delusion. You don't want to end up like those crazy woo people. You don't want to become a new ager or some kind of hippie or some kind of fundamentalist or some kind of cult leader. And of course, there's validity to that concern, but you also have to recognize that this kind of fear and paranoia can go too far, and then that itself becomes a self-deception. What is the psychology of why the rationalists are so allergic to woo and mysticism? Ultimately, it's fear and it's mental attachments. Where do these mental attachments come from? Were they ever proven rigorously? Never. This is just something that you picked up from your culture because of how you were educated. See, as a scientist, you went through a whole STEM education for 10, 20, 30 years, and you don't even perceive the stuff that they taught you in STEM, all the background assumptions, all the methodological rigor and all that. You don't even perceive that as something that is something you're attached to. You just perceive that as just like the normal, reasonable way to be and to make sense of the world. And you never considered the limits of that entire system because you just grew up in it. So rationalism itself, it acts as though it's trying to be factual, but it's not factual, it's emotional. It's an emotional position. Whenever a scientific person gets triggered by Deepak Chopra or woo, this is not factual objective thinking. This is an emotional egoic attachment and a bias. But the rationalist is not self-aware enough to see that within himself because he doesn't believe that self-awareness is really fundamental to doing good science. Because doing good science is just measuring objective stuff, and my emotions don't matter. Internal dynamics of my own mind, internal psychology, that's not important. Because we're just trying to create this mechanistic process of figuring out the world. Leo, eventually a computer just will be able to do it all. A machine will be able to do it. So emotions are irrelevant. See, but even your philosophy that a machine will one day be able to do what a human does, that itself is an emotional attachment you have. You're attached to that idea because that's part of your identity, part of how you think and make sense of the world, part of how you defend your paradigm. See, you have emotional attachments to all of the objections that you put forth towards any points that I make that try to deconstruct your mind. And that's fine. We all have emotional attachments and biases. The issue is, how seriously do you take them? How important are they? Do you see the significance and the implications of this towards your ability to make sense of reality? For example, when a rationalist calls me a cult leader or a grifter or a narcissist or a charlatan, this is not scientific. You didn't do any scientific study to prove that I'm a charlatan. And you're very convinced of that. Or when they say something like, mysticism is bullshit. That's not a scientific statement. That's not an atomic fact. That's, in fact, pseudoscience. You see, the irony here, the contradiction, is that people who love to cry about pseudoscience and call things that they disagree with pseudoscience, that in fact, them doing that is pseudoscience. Because you didn't determine whether that thing over there is pseudoscience by any scientific study, did you? No, you didn't. This is the absurdity of rationalism and this kind of Reddit science bro style of philosophy and sense-making. Ironically, rationalists have an emotional attachment to rationality, and they don't want to admit it. Rationalism doesn't recognize itself as an emotional attachment because a lot of these highly rational people, they're disconnected from their body. They're too much in their logical mind, too left-brained, not enough right-brained, too masculine, not enough feminine. They minimize and dismiss feeling and emotion. They minimize and dismiss consciousness and awareness, as though none of that stuff is very important because it's just fuzzy human stuff, and science doesn't deal with that kind of stuff. But it turns out that if science tries to separate itself from that stuff, then science becomes idiotic and stuck and paradigm locked. Notice that nowhere has science proven that being rigorous and formal maximizes intelligence, truth, or understanding. Nowhere has science proven that being strictly formal is sufficient for understanding reality. Consider this possibility, that being rigorous and formal might limit your understanding of reality because the highest understanding requires subjective imagination and intelligence and personal integration. You need to personally integrate qualitative understanding into a singular mind, which is you. Rationalists might want to save themselves by saying, well, Leo, a computer can figure it out all for me. No, a computer can't figure it out for you because in the end, it all has to be integrated inside your own mind. How do you know you can trust the computer? How do you know the computer did the right job, finished the job? How do you know the computer is being holistic enough? How do you know there's not bugs in the computer? See, you can't escape this issue of personal epistemic responsibility. In the end, when you're making sense of reality, it's only happening within your mind. See, this is what the rationalists understand. The scientist wants to somehow take understanding outside of his own mind and make it this objective thing outside of himself. This is the mistake. Because in order to even buy into that project, you have to buy into it. You have to buy into it, right? You have to accept that this is a valid way of understanding the world, that this is true and not a self-deception and not an illusion and not Maya and not limited, and that there's not something beyond that you're missing. All of these problems arise because you never knew in the first place whether reality was objectifiable. You just assumed that. And see, it never occurred to you that maybe the subjective aspect of reality is fundamental. Maybe it's even more fundamental than the objective aspect. Maybe you got the objective and the subjective backwards. See, the rationalists and the scientists and the academic, they don't care about these things. Can reality be objectified? That's an open empirical question. Yet rationalism assumes the answer without question. Can reality be demystified? That's an open question. Can understanding and intelligence be formalized? That's an open question. And it turns out that the answer to these is no, it can't. So those are the 5 performative contradictions. Contemplate those for yourself. Here's an analogy I want to draw between religious fundamentalism and rationalism. So the rationalist, of course, wants to puff himself up as very different and distinct from the fundamentalist. But they do have a parallel. Of course, rationality is a developmental stage above fundamentalism, but they still share plenty in terms of their cognitive structure. And so here's one of these examples. Rationalism and fundamentalism are both paradigm locked. The paradigm lock of fundamentalism goes like this. If you're a Christian or a Muslim, the structure of your mind works like this. My religion is true. Why is it true? Because it says it's true. And if I doubt that, then that's wrong and evil, and I'm going to be punished, and I'm going to go to hell. So when you try to come in there and you try to question religion, see, it's a self-contained epistemic bubble, a paradigm. And it's hard to see outside of it. Well, there's a similar paradigm lock within rationalism, which goes like this. The rationalist believes that reality is rational, so I will only entertain rational things. And anything which contradicts these rational things is by definition irrational, and therefore I don't need to entertain it. But you see how that's question begging? How circular that is? Any doubting of rationality is considered by the rationalist to just be soft-brained, unscientific, irrational woo. And so it becomes very difficult to dislodge the rationalist from his rationality in the same way that it's almost impossible to dislodge a religious fundamentalist from his religion. There's a further analogy here with religion in that we have this phenomena of religious fundamentalist Christians who interpret the Bible literally. There's different gradations of Christians. There's the literalist ones, and then there's the more figurative, metaphorical kind of Christians who treat Christianity like a mythology. That's like Jordan Peterson. But then there's a lower, less intelligent form of Christian which just literally reads the Bible literally, and every word of the Bible is true. There can be no mistakes in the Bible. It's perfect. All the history in the Bible, these aren't just allegories or moral stories to teach moral lessons. These literally happened. Noah's Ark literally happened and so forth, right? So that's the Christian literalist. So we can see in that example that when the mind is strictly literal, it's literally more stupid than the more figurative mind. For example, the way that Jordan Peterson reads the Bible is much more intelligent because he'll read a story, but he's not focused on the historical accuracy of the story. It doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is understanding the deeper spiritual and moral and philosophical truths, the wisdom contained there, right? The wisdom of treating others the way you want to be treated, the wisdom of loving others, and the kind of moral examples that are set by these sorts of anecdotes from the Bible. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. As long as you don't take it too literally. We'll see, now the scientist mind, the academic mind, is also suffering from being too literal. You could think of this as fundamental to what rationalism is about. It wants to treat reality too literally. It believes that reality literally is just discrete objects called atoms or quarks or molecules or whatever that are just moving around. And that's literally all that it is. And then this kind of literalist mind rationalizes to itself that being literal is actually what gets me closer to the truth. See, the Christian does the same thing as well. The literalist Christian, he doesn't like figurative, more poetic interpretations of the Bible because that's complex, right? As soon as you admit that interpretation is possible with the Bible, then this requires a much more complex mind, because now you can have multiple interpretations and which one is correct. And this becomes very relativistic very quickly. See, a simple-minded person just wants the answers, just wants it black and white. Either there was Noah's Ark or there wasn't Noah's Ark. Either Jesus existed or Jesus does not exist. A literalist, simple-minded Christian doesn't want to hear that Jesus wasn't even a real person. Jesus was just some sort of allegory. They don't want to hear that. They want to know exactly what Jesus looked like. They want to know how tall he was. They want to know how fat he was, how many pounds he weighed, because to them, that's like more real than just some sort of mythopoetic allegory. Well, likewise for the scientific mind, they think that they're being more and more scientific and rigorous when they treat understanding of reality highly literally, and they just want to say, you know what? All that poetic, figurative stuff that Leo talks about, all that mystical stuff, all that highly abstract stuff about consciousness and love, it's like, no. That's all just fluffy woo, and we just want to drill it all down, reduce it down just to atoms, because that's what's literally true. But what they don't understand is that figurative understanding is a higher form of intelligence than literal understanding. And in fact, reality cannot be understood strictly literally, nor can science work that way. That's a fantasy, that's a self-deception. In the same way, analogously to how a Christian literalist is self-deceived about literal interpretations of the Bible. You become more intelligent when your mind is looser than when it's only thinking in terms of atoms and computation and numbers and treating reality as just a computer. Because reality is not just a computer. That's just something you're assuming. That's something you're projecting. See, rigor is not something you find in the world. It's rather something you're projecting onto the world. The world is not as rigorous as scientists and academics think. That's the power of Maya. Maya is all about how you imagine reality to be, then getting reflected back at you in this kind of echo chamber that you self-create with how you misuse your own mind out of a sloppiness and a lack of self-awareness, that then you start to buy into your own fantasies. And the fantasy, again, the scientist and academic mind makes this mistake of thinking that fantasy, Leo, we don't do fantasy here. We're very literal and strict. That's not a fantasy. Fantasy is angels and devils and Noah's Ark. That's fantasy. Here in science, we don't do fantasy. Yes, you do. All of science is a fantasy. It's a rigorous fantasy. Atoms, reality made out of atoms, that's a fantasy. Fantasy can also seem like it's just mundane. Reality being a computer, that's a fantasy. Reality is not a computer. But if you start to think it's a computer, and everybody around you in your department thinks that it's a computer, and all the books that you read tell you that it's a computer, and all the companies you work at, which are tech companies, because you're in the tech field, they all think it's a computer because they're always working with tech, then to you, that's your reality. It seems like it's tech. In the same way that for a literalist Christian, if he just hangs out only his church group, and he only thinks about reality and does philosophy with other Christians like him, he's going to really feel like he's living in a Christian world because he's in a bubble. And academics are in a bubble, and scientists are in a bubble. And so we're trying to pop that bubble. But anytime we try to pop that bubble, the ego gets very threatened. And it doesn't matter if it's a religious ego or a scientific ego, it gets equally threatened. Because this is a much broader issue than which particular paradigm you subscribe to or which beliefs you hold. This goes way beyond any specific belief. So this brings us to the final concluding summation of this part of the series, which is this major point, is that rationalism fails because of creativity and imagination. It simply lacks creativity and imagination to reach the highest levels of intelligence that are possible for the mind. The problem with the academic and STEM mind is that it lacks creativity. It's stifled by formality out of fear of being wrong and by the pressures of needing to objectify in order to create a scientific consensus. Rationalism is the attempt to remove creativity from understanding, truth-seeking, and science. A logical machine that spits out the truth. See, this removes all creativity and imagination. Because creativity and imagination, Leo, that's kind of woo stuff. Because we can't define what creativity is. We can't define what imagination is. We don't know how to measure it. How do you design a test to measure it? How do you measure this in a laboratory? So it's not even real because we can't measure it. Rationalism assumes that reality is a straightforward machine, like a computer that can be understood just by making dumb, objective measurements. And this completely misses the intelligence and genius of reality. It never occurs to the rationalist that creativity and imagination are fundamental to reality, to what reality is, to understanding and to sense-making and to intelligence. Why does it never occur to them? Because the rationalist ontology assumes that reality is just a dumb mechanical machine. And therefore, we can just use a dumb mechanical method to understand this dumb mechanical machine. Has this actually been proven? No, it hasn't. It's just been assumed and projected and then reflected back, and then an echo chamber has been created. Rationalism underestimates the importance of intelligence, misunderstanding what intelligence is by reducing it to some kind of math puzzles, IQ tests, stuff like this. It assumes that humans have roughly the same levels of intelligence. That's wrong. There's many grades of intelligence that humans have, and academics do not have the highest intelligence. Why is this important? Because when I try to teach some of these concepts, the academic mind will say, well, Leo, I should be able to understand what you're talking about here, and it doesn't make sense to me. Therefore, Leo, the things you're talking about must be false. No, it just means that you don't have enough intelligence to understand what I'm talking about. But that possibility doesn't even enter your mind because you're not able to imagine what higher levels of intelligence exist beyond you. Because you just assume that humans all have roughly the same levels of intelligence. And you might say, well, no, Leo, I understand that, people have different IQs. Some people have a 200 level IQ. Yeah, you understand that. But what you don't understand is that intelligence is infinite. You don't understand that. Because none of your colleagues taught you that. No one in academia taught you that. Why? Because none of them are able to prove that intelligence is infinite. And so these academic type of people, they generally tend to assume that all truth is just accessible to anyone of a reasonable level of intelligence. No, it's not. There are some truths, many truths that I teach, the most advanced spiritual truths that I teach are beyond the intelligence of 99.99999% of humans. But see, when I say that, that makes me sound very egotistical and arrogant. It's like, oh, Leo, so you're saying that you're smarter than everybody. I'm saying that intelligence goes infinite. It's not about me personally. This has nothing to do with me or my ego. This is about the nature of mind, what mind really is. To understand all of the material that I teach at the depth that I teach it and the breadth that I teach it requires extraordinary levels of intelligence. That's not a brag. That's not an ego thing. You have to understand that, otherwise you won't be able to appreciate and understand this material. I have to say this. This is not the place for some sort of fake humility. Like, oh, we're just all equally intelligent. We can all understand it. No, Virtually nobody understands what I'm teaching. That's why I'm stressing this so much. See, we're talking about imagination here. How rationalism fails on imagination. The biggest thing it fails to imagine is what truly high intelligence looks like. Imagine an intelligence that is orders of magnitude beyond human. How would that intelligence understand reality? It would not be what academics and scientists and rationalists are doing. See? It would look very weird. It would look strange. It would look alien. It would look mystical. And it would not make sense from your academic paradigm. And it would also not be validated and objectively confirmed by scientific consensus. You see that? Because to create a scientific consensus, you need the average intelligence of all the bureaucratic people in this institution. It would be so far advanced beyond what is considered normal and acceptable within a university that it would be considered insanity. And there would not be any kind of double-blind, placebo-controlled studies for it. And there would not be any kind of peer review for it. And there would not be any research journal that would publish this material. Do you understand that? See, if you can't imagine and understand this, then you're stupid. And you're also conflicted because you're so bought into this academic system and way of understanding the world. The highest understanding is highly imaginative. Why? Because reality literally is nothing but imagination. See, the rationalist doesn't have enough imagination to imagine that everything, including the physical world, could just be imagination. Including atoms. Atoms, numbers, equations, computers, bits of information, quantums of stuff, quarks, strings, quantum field equations. What is all of this? It's imagination. Atoms, imagination is not made out of atoms. Atoms are made out of imagination. And see, now the rationalist says, well, Leo, prove it to me. Where's your double-blind, placebo-controlled study to prove it to me? Where's your research paper? Where's your PhD? See, there you go again. Creativity, intelligence, and imagination are not epiphenomena. They are real. They're not just real, they are reality itself. You are imagining that you're a human. You are imagining science. You are imagining atoms. You are imagining space and time. You are imagining history. You are imagining humanity. You are imagining other people. See? But when I say that, the rationalist wants to say, Leo, that's irrational. That's crazy. That's woo. How do you know? Have you checked? How about you spend the next 10 years checking with an open mind, rather than just assuming that you know better? Reality is a creative trickster. Why must it be this way? Because unless a mind imagines it, nothing exists. Nothing exists outside of imagination. There is no human being as a physical object. There is no human life without imagination of a human life. A human is born when the universe tricks itself into thinking that it's a human. That's why every human being is walking around in profound, infinite denial. Why? Because there is no such thing as a human. A human is just consciousness imagining a story, tricking itself. That's Maya. Your entire life is a self-deception. It doesn't matter if you're a religious nutcase, or you're a conspiracy nutcase, or you're a flat earther, or you're a scientist, or you're an academic, or you're the most rational person in the world. You're lost in Maya. And you are hallucinating your life. So, because your entire life just is nothing but imagination, of course, how do you jailbreak yourself out of that imagination? Well, by using more imagination. You need enough imagination to be able to outsmart Maya, to be able to anticipate Maya and its self-deception. And so the highest intelligence is that which is able to deconstruct illusions, the ultimate illusion being your own life as a scientist. If you can't deconstruct that, you're not actually intelligent because you've been fooled by the intelligence of the universe. See, the universe is not dumb. The universe is infinitely intelligent. And it's using that intelligence to construct and imagine your entire scientific life from birth to death. Your entire scientific career is just imagination. And it requires extraordinary intelligence to be able to see through that illusion, how it's being spun. And what I teach is all the mechanisms of the mind that are spinning the illusion that is your scientific life. And you need to be able to have enough imagination to see that what I'm talking about is not some theory that I have. It's not a belief system. This is literally what's happening in your life. And that none of your colleagues are aware of this. Because they're not intelligent enough. But see, when I say that, then the conclusion, that implies that I'm more intelligent than all of your colleagues. And the answer is yes, I am. But when I say that, that makes me sound very arrogant and kind of like narcissistic. Like, Leo, how dare you? You think you're more intelligent than everyone at university? And my answer is yes, I am. That's just a fact. And the reason I say that is because I want you to actually contend with what I'm saying. Like, this is very, very serious, right? We're not playing games here. This is very serious. This is life and death here. Life and death. You're not going to be able to really learn from me until you realize just how intelligent what I'm trying to teach you is. And that's not because I'm a narcissist about this. It's because truly I have figured out how to access universal intelligence simply by deconstructing all illusions. And that's what I teach. And you can do that too if you're just willing to actually be open-minded enough and imaginative enough to follow some of these principles, and you really, care about truth-seeking and not just science or academia. But see, what I'm saying here, it's so at odds with what you've been taught by your culture and by society and by academics. And it sounds crazy. And so your mind wants to reject it because it doesn't seem plausible. How could some guy on YouTube, be so smart? It doesn't seem plausible. It seems much more plausible that just all the academics are right. And that this is just some, crazy crackpot on YouTube talking about stuff. So creativity and imagination are inherently intuitive, figurative, fuzzy, loose. Creativity and imagination cannot be formalized or mechanized. This is a feature, not a bug. Do you understand that following rules is not creative? Is not intelligent? The highest intelligence doesn't follow rules. It imagines and invents rules. It skirts all the rules. It doesn't need rules. Rules are for mediocre minds. They need rules. Rationalism fails to understand that what it calls woo is actually rational and true, just in ways that it cannot imagine because it's so locked into this narrow paradigm. And it's reduced away imagination down to atoms. See, when I talk about imagination, the academic mind doesn't treat imagination as a serious thing because it just thinks of imagination as just neurons and atoms and calculations at the end of the day. But when I'm talking about imagination, I'm saying that imagination is more important, more real, more fundamental than atoms, numbers, equations, or any of your science or math. You don't yet understand what imagination is or its power. This is a completely alien paradigm to you from the STEM paradigm that you've been working in your whole life. Mankind's formality and fear and autism has separated you from your infinite divine creative intelligence. That's not woo. You are an infinite mind. You're an infinite mind who's been fooled and self-deceived into thinking that you're a finite mind. And academia played that role, just in the same way that the religious fundamentalist was brainwashed into believing he's a Christian. In the same way, you as the STEM scientist, academic rationalist, have been brainwashed by your cultural system, because what's the common thread? Christianity is just a cultural system, and STEM education is just another cultural system. That's all that it is. It's not some high-level universal intelligence. You've been brainwashed by decades of academia into believing that creativity, intelligence, love, God, consciousness, imagination are unreal. This is a crime worse than religion. It's just that it's obvious with religion. It's not obvious with your, academia. Notice that it's not a coincidence that artists have high openness, high creativity, high intuition. They're very right-brained. They also suffer more from schizophrenia and psychosis and mental illness than non-artists. Why is that? Because to do great art, you need to be highly creative. To be highly creative, your mind needs to be much more loose than the scientific mind of somebody working in a laboratory. So there's a tension here that there's a trade-off. As your mind becomes looser and more creative, it becomes more powerful, more imaginative, but at the same time, it becomes less rigorous and it can make more mistakes. And so what academia prioritizes in this trade-off relationship is technical rigor so that we make no mistakes because they want to preserve their, authority. They want perfect truthfulness. But when you do that, your mind becomes so dry, so mechanical, so literal, so computer and robotic-like, so autistic that you lose touch to the imaginative aspects of mind. To the point where you demonize and marginalize the creative, artistic aspects of mind, and you draw a sharp boundary between science and art. And in this way, you paradigm lock yourself and you limit your mind into a finite, that's all you are, it's just this finite, limited human mind, and you can't imagine a higher form of mind. And so rationalism ends up missing the poetry of mind. Poetry is not seen as real. It's seen as a fantasy. This rigorous stuff is seen as real. But this rigorous stuff is a fantasy. It's a rigorous fantasy that you've constructed and that now you're defending. here's a key point, is that irrationality is actually necessary in order to get serious intuition and serious creativity and serious intelligence. Because if you introspect into the internal workings of your own mind, what you realize is that your mind, it doesn't think in, perfectly logical sentences. You get flashes of irrational stuff and images. Even as a scientist, you're thinking about stuff, and your thinking is not, you're not thinking in like well-written paragraphs. You're getting flashes of insight here and there, and you're getting mental images, and you're getting weird stuff. And sometimes you might get an image of a demon in your mind. Sometimes you might get an image of sex. Sometimes you might get an image of two demons having sex with you, right? And it's irrational. That's irrational. But being able to navigate this like an expert ice skater or a surfer, that's the skill of navigating consciousness and imagination. And it's this dreamlike quality of consciousness. Literally, the dreams you experience at night, right? You might consider those very irrational. They break linear causality. They break space and time. They're very weird and alien-like. And you might say, well, that has nothing to do with science. But your entire life is dreamt from this higher aspect of consciousness. Where do you think your life came from? It came from that dream realm, except it's been solidified down into this human life that you think is now materially real. So what I'm saying is that kind of irrational aspect in your mind is necessary. In an artist, their mind is more irrational, and that gives them more weird ideas, and these weird ideas lead to flashes of insight, visions, and mystical experiences and so forth, which is this kind of highly fluid aspect of consciousness, which gives it that kind of requisite variety that is necessary to outsmart problems and to gets itself out of stubborn situations, and also produces beautiful things, imagines new beautiful things that have never been imagined before, imagines new ways of understanding the world, imagines new ways of physics. See? In order to reconcile quantum mechanics with general relativity, you have to imagine a new way of conceiving of physics that no human has ever imagined before. Where do you think that comes from? That's not going to come from some sort of rigorous laboratory work. That's going to come from some artistic feat of imagination. From some kind of thought, weird alien thought experiments. But academia beats that imagination out of you because it's too dangerous. It looks crazy. It leads to psychosis and madness in the worst case examples. Schizophrenia, multiple personality disorders, and so forth. And yet, that's where the highest intelligence lies. And yes, it is dangerous. The highest stages of understanding are informal, figurative, loose, nebulous, analogical, poetic, qualitative, aesthetic, personal, emotional, subjective, witty, clever, inspired, visionary, beatific, sublime, and even divine and mystical at the highest stages. And they're also profoundly abstract. Levels of abstraction you can't even imagine are possible. This is where serious intelligence happens. And it's dangerous. It's not just dangerous, it's life-threatening. It's threatening to your personal life, it's threatening to your personal sanity and mental health, and it's also threatening to the human collective. It's threatening to all human institutions. It threatens politically, it threatens all paradigms. It threatens all religions, it threatens science, it threatens all rational frameworks. The highest intelligence is divinely inspired. When your intelligence reaches infinity, your intelligence becomes divine because the universe is infinite intelligence and infinite imagination. That's not woo. That's what it is. That's technically what it is. That's rigorously what it is when you're being truly rigorous. Not your fake rational scientific rigor. I mean true rigor. in the open-minded sense and in the completely unbiased sense. All the rules and norms and formality and objectifications of academia and all the bureaucracy prevent the mind from realizing its own infinite nature by obstructing imagination. Academic sense-making is too finite and linear in its imagination. Of course, they use imagination, but it's too linear and too finite. And so rationalism blocks the flow of infinite intelligence through your mind. You cannot take the art out of intelligence and understanding. And if you try to, it's going to make you less intelligent. Imagination is even just required for the rationalist to be able to imagine how he might be wrong. See, just to see that you're a scientist and that you're wrong requires a lot of imagination. Because you need to create a convincing vision of how you're wrong, not just a stupid straw man. It's very hard to imagine how science can be wrong. Fundamentally, not in little details, I mean fundamentally as a paradigm. That takes enormous intelligence and imagination to see that. But see, most academics think that this is not important to their work because, hey, I need to just do my lab work on my organic chemistry or something, and that's not important to me. That's the paradigm lock. The funny thing is that imagination is the only reality. It's so powerful that it imagines that reality is atomic and just rigorous and computational. But the rationalist lacks the imagination to realize that that is all imagination. See, you cannot reach Actualized.org levels of intelligence through any formal system. How do you think I figured all this shit out? Was it by following rules? Was it by being a good student in academia? No. You can't get this level of understanding through any kind of bureaucratic human system or following any norms or rules. I had to break all the rules. I even had to go learn spiritual stuff in Buddhism and non-duality, and then I had to break all those rules too. I had to have the gall to do that, the arrogance to do that. So what I'm teaching you is what I embody. What I am teaching you is the intelligence that is fueling all of these videos. And the intelligence behind that is the intelligence that I unlocked by adhering to the core principles of serious truth-seeking, caring about the truth, and radical open-mindedness, and infinite requisite variety. The reason I'm so intelligent is because my mind is so open. This allows me to access transhuman levels of intelligence. And also because I've been working on mastering my own mind and self for the last 15 years. Studying all the different self-deception mechanisms within myself. And I'm not claiming that I've mastered my mind or anything like that, or myself. I'm nowhere even close to mastery of my own mind. But I'm a lot further along than any academic, which is why mentally I'm able to run circles around any academic, right? Because all an academic does is just study his narrow technical field. He's worried about publishing research papers and, teaching students in his university, stuff like that. I'm worried about how to understand God. That's literally my job. See, just that difference in focus makes all the difference. You can't have a university career focused on understanding God because they won't accept you. They'll kick you out. The highest understanding is creative genius. God is creative genius. And rationalism is not visionary enough and does not understand the importance of vision. See, you have to have the vision to see that what I'm pointing to is real and is worth pursuing, and it takes a lot of work to then actualize it. Okay, we're going to end on this. This is the most profound part of this whole episode. I want to explain to you what infinite intelligence is, actually. No scientist or academic understands what intelligence is. Here's what it really is. You have a mind, and we're going to call it, for now, a neural network, let's just say. So there's going to be a little bit of an analogy between computer networks and neural networks. So you have a neural network. This neural network exists and is trying to figure out the world. But as it's trying to figure out the world, it's doing this by symbolizing the world. So you could also say that it's a neural network, but you could also say more abstractly, because we want to take it out of the physical atomic domain. Because when I say neural network, you think of actual physical neurons. I want to take it out of that into a symbolic network. What you actually have is a symbolic network, is a collection of images and symbols that are interlinked with each other that make sense of the world. This is fundamentally what's going on. Whether you're doing science or religion, doesn't matter. A scientific mind, a religious mind, any other kind of mind is a symbolic network. Now the question is, how deep is this symbolic network? How well does it understand the world out there and also internally itself? Because first you're just looking out there and making sense of the world, but then eventually the network starts to self-reflect and turn in on itself. And it starts to ask itself, well, wait a minute, what is the world and what am I as this network? Because the network initially doesn't understand what it is. And so the network needs to represent itself to itself somehow through symbols. That's what a symbolic network is. So it tries to represent itself. At first, it has an image of itself as maybe a network, or as a human face if it's happening inside of a body, or if it's a computer, it might represent itself as a PC computer or something, as a CPU chip. And then it'll try to represent that. It'll say, well, but what is a CPU? Or what is a brain? You might represent it as a brain. What is a brain? Well, a brain is just molecules. And what is molecules? Well, that's just atoms. And what is atoms? And then you get to quantum field equations, right? But what are those? And so you're trying to, fundamentally, this network is trying to understand itself in the world. The world and itself are really the same thing, but the network, every time it's symbolizing, it's also subdividing the world and it's defining the world into parts. It's like, that's an apple, that's a tree, that's a human, this is me, that's not me, that's a scientist, that's a crazy religious nutcase, that's a cult leader, right? It's symbolizing all this stuff and it's trying to make sense. It's like, wait a minute, what's going on? What am I ultimately? The network is trying to figure out what it is, but it's always failing at doing so because no matter what it says it is, it's only just a small part of this larger thing called reality. And so this network, it's always symbolizing and representing itself to itself with finite images and finite symbols. And it's confusing one of those symbols or images or parts for being what it really is, which is not what it really is. And so when this system gets very serious about ontology and figuring out what actually am I, and what is everything made out of, ultimately, what's everything made out of? And it questions deeper and deeper and deeper. It probes into itself, and it's looking at different parts of itself from different angles, and it's getting deeper and deeper self-reflection into itself. Eventually, what it realizes is that it's not any part of this system, but rather it goes infinite. It realizes that it's not an atom, that an atom is just something it's symbolizing and representing to itself. And it's not a neuron, and it's not a number, and it's not an equation, and it's not a computer, and it's not a brain, and it's not a human, and it's not an object, it's not physics, it's not science, it's not religion, it's not anything. And when it realizes that it's not anything, it realizes that it's nothing, and it goes infinite. It jailbreaks itself free of any finite ontology. And when that happens, it literally merges into the entire universe, and it realizes that I'm not a finite system, I'm an infinite fucking mind. Imagining myself from different perspectives as different things. But I'm not any of those things. I'm infinity. And when that happens, it becomes infinitely intelligent. Mind jailbreaks itself of all of its own finitudes, self-imagined limitations. It realizes that every ontological construct that it had was just a self-imposed imaginary limit, and it goes unlimited. And that's what God is. God is not a bearded man in the clouds. God is when a mind frees itself ontologically from all of its finite, self-imposed imaginary limitations. And it realizes that it is whatever it imagines that it is. This happens through infinite self-reflection and infinite requisite variety. And when this happens, this neural network now maintains its finitude, but also now is part and connected to and merged with, ontologically, the entire universe. And therefore, universal intelligence now flows through this network. This network becomes a superconductor for universal intelligence. And that's what mysticism is. Mysticism is when your symbolic neural network now has access to universal intelligence, the creativity and imagination which constructed your entire life and all of science and everything. And now you have access to that imagination, which now feeds you visions and profound mystical insights that are highly abstract and deeply figurative, symbolic, metaphorical, analogical, fuzzy, and it's able to, not following any rules in a completely amorphous way, it's able to make sense of itself and the world. And this is ultimate creativity. This is the creativity and imagination that imagines galaxies and universes and entire lives and psyches. In order for this to happen, in order to jailbreak this symbolic network in this way, what needs to happen is a complete integration into the subjective internal understanding of oneself, a complete unity of mind. This only happens when you're so holistic about everything, right, that you're not locked into any particular narrow way of looking at the world or yourself. It requires total internal integration. So what's happening here is a finite system is awakening to its own infinitude through unity. The system, the symbolic system, is unifying with itself. And that's the highest intelligence, is the recognition of unity. When the mind recognizes that it's one with the entire universe, that's the highest intelligence. A completely unified mind. So you see, when the scientist who is just doing his organic chemistry or his quantum mechanics, and that's all, he just has his blinders on and that's all he cares about, and he says, Leo, I don't care about all this philosophy stuff. See, what he's unwittingly doing is he's limiting, artificially self-imposing that limit on his mind by limiting his focus. And therefore, his symbolic network is not able to have enough holism to create the unity necessary to jailbreak the mind into oneness with the universe. Because that just sounds like woo, man. Leo, that's just woo. That's some irrational stuff, right? No. This is real rationality. True rationality is realizing unity with the universe. True rationality is infinity. It's irrational to keep yourself locked into a small, narrow, physics department in a university when you could be an infinite mind. You could be galaxy brained over here, or you could just keep studying your stupid, quantum physics for the rest of your life. What's more intelligent? The problem is that guy doesn't even understand what he's missing. So this is what I teach. And this is why we're deconstructing rationality, is because I'm trying to get your mind to go infinite. I'm trying to get this finite symbolic network that you have going to feed it enough different perspectives on itself so that finally you get so deep into the ontology of what you ultimately are that you realize that you're infinity, that you're God. All right, that's it for part 2, but we're not done. There's still much, much more to go. A lot of deep stuff coming in part 3, which will be out in a few weeks, more or less. Stay tuned for that. Make sure you go read Rationality.com. That's your homework assignment. And there's a bonus homework assignment because David Chapman doesn't just have that one website. He has a second website called meaningness.com. Meaningness.com. So go search for that and start reading that. You have a lot of homework here. And the last thing that I'll warn you about is this. Do not assume that you already understand what I'm teaching. This is a very common mistake that I see some of my more intermediate and even advanced students doing, is that, they watch 50 or 100 of my videos, and then they finally say to themselves, okay, Leo, I got it. I figured it out. Awakening, God, whatever, I took a few psychedelics. Leo, I figured it out. I got it. You have nothing more to teach me. No, you're wrong. That's a self-deception. I have a lot more to teach you. There's a lot more you don't understand. So be very careful about that trap of thinking all of this stuff is stuff that you understand. The depth here is infinite. And we're just going to keep going deeper and deeper. Deeper and deeper. Stay with me. Don't trick yourself. Be very careful. Do not trick yourself that you understand this stuff. And do not trick yourself into thinking that if you're new to this work, you might think, oh, this is kind of trivial. Leo's talking about trivial things. Nothing I ever say is trivial. If it sounds trivial, it's just because it takes a long time. I might be saying some small point that is trivial by itself in isolation, but you have to put it into the context of hundreds of other videos that I've released. The reason that my videos are so long and so involved and so deep is because this is the depth that is necessary to ultimately jailbreak your mind to reach the kind of crazy levels of intelligence that I'd like you to reach. So that's our project here. Stay tuned for more.